What if the story of humanity did not begin with men, but with gods who once walked the earth as rulers? Before our kings built cities of brick, there were names carved into wet clay that spoke of reigns lasting tens of thousands of years, when time itself seemed to breathe differently. The Sumerian Kings List whispers this forgotten order, where heaven and earth were one, and power descended like light upon the rivers. Perhaps those who ruled then were not merely myth, but memory, a trace of something vast that the world has chosen to forget. So let us drift into the quiet of that ancient plain, where the Tigris and Euphrates still murmur of gods and men, and listen to what remains when the noise of history fades. The first-time scholars laid eyes on the Sumerian Kings List. It was as though history itself had cracked open a door to a world both familiar and impossibly strange. A single ununiform tablet, weathered and broken, told of kings whose reigns stretched not for decades, but for millennia, of divine rulers who governed the earth before the first flood, before even the first brick of Uruk had touched the ground. It was unearthed from the ruins of ancient Nippur among fragments of myth and account of harvest and tribute. Yet this one spoke not of men, but of time itself bending to something greater. When kingship descended from heaven, the tablet begins. A phrase that has haunted archaeologists for more than a century. To the modern eye, it seems like poetry. But to those who carved it, it was history. Each name inscribed into clay, each number impossibly long, tens of thousands of years of rule, carried the weight of divine legitimacy. Alulim, the first king of Eridu, is said to have ruled for 28,800 years. His successor Algar for 36,000. These numbers stretch beyond comprehension. And yet they are listed with the same precision as later dynasties, as though nothing in them were symbolic. The tablet does not wink at the reader, does not signal myth. It presents itself as record, and perhaps that is why it unsettles, because it blurs the fragile line between faith and fact. Some have tried to explain it away. They say the numbers were symbolic, expressions of power rather than duration. They say time in the ancient world was not measured as ours is. They point out that Sars, and near the Sumerian cycles of time, may have been misunderstood, multiplied through errors of translation. Yet even these explanations feel like attempts to bring the ungraspable down to the size of reason. For why, one wonders, would a civilization so skilled in mathematics, in astronomy, in record-keeping, confuse its own measures of time when kingship descended from heaven? The phrase echoes through the ages like a refrain from a forgotten hymn. It is not merely a metaphor, and it implies a transfer of order, a beginning that was not human. The Sumerians, among the first to write, did not see the divine as distant. To them, the gods were administrators present in temples and courts, their decrees carried out by priests and rulers. But the King's List suggests something more, that once the gods themselves ruled in flesh and form, and then abruptly they did not. After the reigns of the antediluvian kings, the text declares, the flood swept over. And when the waters receded, kingship once again descended from heaven. But something had changed. The numbers shrink, the reigns shorten, Where once a king ruled for 36,000 years, now he rules for hundreds. As if the divine clock had slowed, as if the bond between heaven and earth had been weakened or deliberately severed. Archaeologists have long debated what flood the text refers to. Was it a local catastrophe, the overflow of the Euphrates, or a cultural memory of a global deluge that marked the end of an age? In the sediment layers beneath Sumerian cities, there are traces of destruction, of silt and ash. They speak of waters that once swallowed the plains. Yet the story's weight feels larger than any geological event. It reads like an inheritance, a warning carried through time. Something was lost, and what replaced it was not the same. The strangeness of the King's List lies not only in its numbers, but in its calm certainty. It does not argue. It simply states it is the quiet confidence of a record keeper, not a poet. And perhaps that is why it lingers, because it refuses to tell us whether it speaks of gods or of men made gods. Was it myth or memory? Did those long reigning figures truly exist? Or were they the condensation of eras, dynasties, and cycles that later scribes woo into divine order? Or could it be that those who wrote it were preserving something they only half understood? A story handed down from before their own dawn, when knowledge was still sung, not inscribed. In the quiet of the museum, where the Nippur tablet now rests, the faint wedge marks in the clay catch the light. They are tiny, fragile things, yet within them entire ages unfold. The flood, the descent of kingship, the breath of gods. We read them now with curiosity, perhaps even with disbelief. But for the Sumerians, these were coordinates of reality. They did not invent their gods. They remembered them. Some modern researchers have drawn parallels between the King's List and other ancient traditions, the biblical patriarchs who lived for centuries, the Egyptian pharaohs whose divine descent legitimized their rule, the myths of Zept, the first time when gods and men shared the earth. Each of these traditions seems to echo the same loss, a fading of proximity between humanity and something far greater. Could the King's List then be the oldest surviving fragment of a shared memory, one carried across cultures, refracted through language and time? What unsettles is not merely that the Sumerians wrote of gods as kings, but that they measured their reigns. They gave them dates, durations, succession. It is as though they wished to insist this was real. Yet every number contradicts what we believe possible. How can 200 years fit within the limits of recorded history? The modern mind seeks to compress it, to rationalize it, to fit it into the safe contours of chronology. But perhaps the King's List was never meant to fit. Perhaps it was meant to remind. When kingship descended from heaven, the world was not yet divided into myth and history, faith and reason. It was one seamless fabric woven from the same light. The Sumerian scribes may have known that the truth of origins is not something one can measure in years. Perhaps to them the span of 36,000 years was simply another way of saying once eternity touched the earth. And if that is so, then what was the flood? An ending or an act of concealment? What if the gods did not vanish but withdrew, leaving behind a world that would someday forget them, yet still bear their fingerprints in stone, in language, in memory? In the silence between those wedge-shaped marks, it is as if the earth itself waits for someone to remember. Perhaps the King's List was not a chronicle of the past, but a map for the imagination, a reminder that what we call history may only be the shadow of something far older, if we linger on that single phrase. When kingship descended from heaven, it opens more than a line of translation. It opens an abyss, for in it lies the earliest known description of authority as something divine, not earned or inherited, but bestowed from beyond. In a sense, this tablet is not just a record of rulers. It is the first philosophy of power. Yet, its vision of kingship is unlike anything that would follow in later empires. It is not the divine right of kings. It is not metaphor. It is a literal descent, as if the heavens once lowered their gates, and from them stepped beings who brought order to the earth. The Sumerians, pragmatic in their rituals and precise in their mathematics, were not prone to empty symbolism. Their gods had addresses, temples, and duties. Each deity was tied to a domain: the wind, the waters, the stars. And yet in the King's List, these divine figures seemed to take form as rulers who measured their reigns not by the harvest or the flood, but by epochs. This was not religion as we know it. It was administration on a cosmic scale. In Eridu, where the first of these kings ruled, archaeologists have uncovered layers of settlement that reach back to the 6th millennium BCE. Beneath each city level lies another older one, like the strata of a forgotten memory. The deeper one digs, the more the line between history and prehistory dissolves. The earliest temples there were built not of brick, but of mud and reed, rising like small mountains beside the water. Eridu was known as the city of the first kings, and its patron deity Enki, lord of wisdom, crafts, and freshwater, was said to have dwelled in the Abzu, the subterranean ocean. It was Enki, legend says, who shaped mankind from clay. And it was Enki who first taught men to build, to measure, to write. If the King's List is to be believed, Eridu was the cradle not only of civilization, but of divine governance. It was the place where the boundary between heaven and earth first blurred, where divine knowledge, the laws of existence, was shared. In this vision, humanity did not stumble into order. It was instructed. Civilization did not arise as an accident of survival. It was granted, perhaps even designed. When one studies the artifacts of Eridu, the conical temple towers, the layers of ash and baked clay, the strange symmetry of their early shrines, one feels a certain precision, a sense of continuity that should not have existed so early. It is as though those who built them remembered something already perfected. Could it be that what we call the first civilization was itself an echo, a reconstruction of an older pattern carried through flood and silence? Among scholars, this question remains taboo, not because it is unthinkable, but because it threatens the fragile hierarchy of knowledge. To admit the possibility that the Sumerians remembered something they did not invent would be to reopen the wound of origins. It would blur the line between myth and evidence, between inspiration and inheritance. Yet, the further archaeology advances, the more anomalies it finds. Precision astronomy in a culture we call primitive. Advanced hydraulic systems where metallurgy was barely born, and a script so complex that even its earliest form suggests mastery rather than invention. How then did the Sumerians become the first to write, to legislate, to record the heavens? Why did they speak of cycles of pre-dynastic reigns of divine eras with such calm certainty? And why does the King's List, across its many copies, maintain the same structure, the same sequence of rulers, as if echoing a template remembered from long before? Some point to the flood as a metaphor, a cleansing of eras, yet the geological record hints at events that could have inspired such memory. Around 10,000 BCE, as the last ice age ended, the melting of glaciers caused sea levels to rise dramatically, drowning vast stretches of land from Mesopotamia to the Indus. Coastal plains vanished beneath the sea. River systems shifted, and entire populations were displaced. It is not impossible that the memory of such a cataclysm endured for millennia, woven into every myth of deluge. From Noah to Utnapishtim to Deucalion, the Sumerians may have preserved not a fable, but a collective trauma, the memory of a world that had once been whole. And yet, the King's List is too structured, too deliberate to be mere myth. It reads like a transmission, carefully copied through generations, its order preserved even as languages changed. The earliest copies found in Nippur date to around 2100 BCE, but linguistic traces suggest the core of the text may have existed long before. This is not unusual. Oral traditions often precede written form. What is unusual is the consistency. Across multiple versions separated by centuries, the pre-flood kings remain the same. Their names do not drift. Their durations do not waver. It is as if the Sumerians were copying not invention but memory. Perhaps that is why the King's List does not ask to be believed. It only asks to be remembered. In its silence, there is reverence, not for the kings themselves, but for what they signify. The age before forgetting. The time when the sacred and the temporal were one. When kingship descended from heaven, the world was new and language was pure. The first words carved into clay were not laws or prayers. They were names. To name was to recall, to draw the past into the present. And so even as centuries folded upon one another, the Sumerians wrote, as though they were not inventing history, but recovering it. They called their script cuneiform, but perhaps it was something older, a memory system in clay. Today, as we decipher their tablets, we may not be translating words, but echoes. The rhythm of their numbers, the symmetry of their kings, the repetition of descent and flood, all seem less like inventions than patterns of remembrance. What if the King's List was not an account of time past, but of cycles repeating, a map of recurrence, where divine order returns again and again, reshaping humanity under new names, new tongues? If that is so, then what does it mean that our own age has forgotten the descent of kingship? Have we severed the bond entirely, or merely forgotten how to perceive it? The Sumerians spoke of eras as breaths of the divine. We speak of them as data. Somewhere between their tablets and our screens, something has shifted. A silence has entered. Perhaps the King's List was not meant to explain the past, but to warn of amnesia, to remind that every civilization, no matter how rational or advanced, stands upon the same fragile memory that once the heavens touched the earth. And as we stare at the cracked clay and museum glass beneath sterile light, one might feel that same touch, faint, distant, like a vibration beneath the surface of time. Not a myth, not yet a truth, but something waiting to be remembered again. There is a moment in every civilization when memory hardens into history. What once was song becomes inscription, and what once was mystery becomes record. The Sumerian Kings List stands precisely at that threshold where divine remembrance was translated into the measured rhythm of human words. But if the text records the descent of kingship, it also hints at something darker, the slow ascent of forgetting. For between the reigns of the gods and the reigns of men lies a silence, a gap filled only by water, the flood. The flood in Sumerian tradition was not merely a natural disaster. It was the hinge of time, a deliberate severing of eras. Before it, divine kings ruled the world for hundreds of millennia. After it, the reigns became mortal. The King's List, so calm and orderly, hides within its structure a cosmic trauma, a deliberate break. It does not tell us why the flood came, only that it came, and that when it passed, kingship descended again from heaven. The repetition of descent implies a restoration, but also a reset. What had been whole was remade. Yet something in the tone of the text suggests that not everything returned. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, written centuries later, this memory appears again. The flood as punishment, as renewal, as loss. The survivor Utepishtim speaks of gods weeping at their own destruction. But even there, one senses that something older underlies the myth. A sense that the flood was not just an event, but an erasure. The pre-flood world is remembered not for its wickedness, but for its closeness to the divine. And in its disappearance, humanity inherited not only the earth, but exile. Archaeologists, searching for evidence of this flood, found beneath the ruins of Uruk a thick layer of river-borne clay, sterile, silent, separating one stratum of human life from another. It is dated around 2900 CE, roughly the time when the earliest dynastic lists begin. Above its cities rise again. Uruk, Kish, Lagash, their kings, now mortal their reigns, measured in decades, not ages. Below it lies an emptiness, a forgotten plain. The sediment does not tell stories. It only confirms the pause that there was at least once a dividing line between worlds. And yet, to the Sumerians, this was not the first ending. Their myths speak of cycles, of creations and destructions, of knowledge lost and rediscovered. The flood was merely one of many veils. Each time kingship descends anew, and each time humanity must learn again what it once knew. It is an idea that will echo across millennia through Egyptian, Vedic, and Hebrew traditions. The belief that civilization itself is not a straight path, but a spiral that we rise not from ignorance to knowledge, but through layers of remembrance and forgetting. Why then do we resist this notion so deeply? Perhaps because it threatens the story we tell ourselves. That progress is linear, that we are the apex of time. To imagine that the ancients remembered something we have lost is to question our entire map of history. It asks whether knowledge may decay, just as surely as flesh. In the ruins of Eridu, beneath the broken ziggurat, Excavators found the foundations of at least 17 temples, each built directly atop the one before. 17 restorations of the same design, as though some ancient blueprint was being imitated again and again across ages. The pattern suggests more than continuity. It suggests devotion to an ideal, as if each generation was trying to recapture a memory already slipping away. Each reconstruction weaker, smaller, until finally the tradition itself faded, leaving only myth. The King's List may be part of that same compulsion to remember by repetition, to inscribe what could no longer be seen. For even the later Sumerians, centuries removed from the first dynasties, still copied the list with reverence. They did not fully understand its numbers. They did not need to. They copied them because forgetting was unthinkable. And yet, even as they remembered the gods as kings, they also began to rationalize them. The divine rulers were folded into pantheons, assigned temples, given priests to speak for them. The more they were worshipped, the less they were believed. Over time, the living presence of divinity became abstraction, replaced by ritual and calendar. The descent from heaven had become doctrine. The gods who once walked among men were now sealed in clay figurines and temple hymns. The divine compressed into symbol. It is a paradox that repeats across civilizations. The Egyptians called it the age of the gods, then the age of the demigods, and finally the age of men. The Greeks called it the golden age, then the silver, then the iron. Always the pattern is the same. A slow withdrawal of the divine, a shortening of lifespans, a dimming of light. The Sumerian Kings List is simply the first written trace of that decline. It is the echo of a universal memory that the world was once closer to the sacred. If we read the King's List not as history, but as metaphor, what might it say about us? Perhaps the descent of kingship was not about celestial rulers, but about consciousness itself, a descent of order into chaos, of mind into matter. The gods who ruled for thousands of years may have been symbols of an earlier state of harmony, when humanity still perceived the unity of all things. The flood then could represent the fall into separation, the birth of ego, of time, of history. Yet to reduce it entirely to allegory would also be a mistake. The precision of the list defies pure symbolism. It insists upon chronology, upon detail. It wants to be read as record. And so we are left in the space between the literal and the symbolic, the remembered and the forgotten. That is where all mystery lies. What haunts scholars most is the way the King's List begins not with a creation, but with governance. It assumes the world already exists. It begins with the act of ruling. When kingship descended from heaven, it says not when the world was made nor when man was formed. Civilization begins not with life, but with order. It is as though the Sumerians understood that power preceded existence. That structure was the first breath of creation. Could it be that what they described was not the birth of kings, but the installation of law itself, the arrival of pattern into chaos? If so, then heaven may not refer to a sky of gods, but to a realm of principles, a higher logic that shaped the earth below. The kings, divine or not, were its manifestation, embodiment of cosmic law. Across the centuries, as empires rose and fell, this idea would mutate. Divine order became royal decree, celestial law became political hierarchy. But the origin, that descent, still lingers in language, in myth, in the dream of authority. The King's List is not merely about rulers long dead. It is about the inheritance of obedience, the memory of a time when power was not seized, but granted, and the ache of knowing that we live in its absence. And so the tablet endures not as an answer, but as an opening. It invites us to look at history not as a ladder, but as a wheel to see in its long, impossible numbers a message that civilization is not the first nor the last, but one more ripple in a tide of remembering and forgetting. Perhaps after all the gods did not leave. Perhaps they simply receded watching as we tried to rebuild what was once freely given. And maybe in the faint grooves of clay, they left us a reminder that all thrones are temporary and all knowledge borrowed. That even kings who rule for 36,000 years will one day be reduced to dust and whispers. If the King's List was meant to be remembered, then perhaps it was not addressed to its own age at all, but to ours. There is a peculiar humility in how the Sumerians recorded time, a recognition that knowledge, no matter how sacred, will eventually erode. The clay tablets pressed with their fragile wedge marks were not built to impress. They were built to endure. Clay can break, but not decay. And so, millennia later, we can still run our fingers across those faint impressions and feel the pulse of an age that refused to forget. Yet, what exactly were they trying to preserve? A history, a warning, or the echo of something so vast that only metaphor could hold it? Each of the pre-flood kings, Alulim, Alalgar, and Manlo-Anna, and Minol-Anna, Dumuzi the shepherd and others appears not as mythic abstraction, but as lineage. Each name follows the next with bureaucratic precision. He ruled for 43 years, 200 years. Then Eridu fell and kingship was taken to Badira. The tone is clerical, not poetic. It sounds less like scripture than an inventory. Yet that very dryness makes it more haunting, because it does not seek to convince. It simply states as though the impossible were once ordinary. When scholars compared the Sumerian Kings List to later Akkadian and Babylonian versions, they discovered something remarkable. The same pattern persisted. The sequence of divine and semi-divine rulers remained consistent across empires, even as languages changed and deities were renamed. This suggests continuity not just of text but of belief. A secret history carried forward by scribes who no longer fully understood what they were copying but sensed that its meaning was older than themselves. Some have speculated that the immense reigns represent dynasties rather than individuals or even astronomical cycles. There are curious correlations between the listed durations and known processional movements of the Earth. Cycles of roughly 820 years mirrored in several of the kings' reigns multiplied by units of 60, the sacred Sumerian base. Could it be that the King's List encoded celestial knowledge, a cosmic calendar hidden in mythic form? To the ancients, the sky was not a backdrop. It was a ledger of destiny. The descent of kingship may have mirrored the descent of constellations, as though the heavens themselves dictated the rhythm of civilization. But what makes this speculation intriguing is not its mathematics. it is its psychology. Why did the Sumerians feel compelled to bind their divine kings to time at all? Why measure eternity in years? To measure is to fear loss. To record is to anticipate forgetting. The King's List may thus reveal a civilization already aware that it stood upon the ruins of something older. Their precision, their obsession with sequence, feels like an act of preservation, the attempt to hold on to fragments of an age they knew was slipping beyond recall. In later Mesopotamian theology, the gods would grow distant, their temples grand but empty. Yet in the earliest texts, the divine remains strangely intimate, not a force to be worshipped, but to be remembered. When the tablet says, "Kingship descended from heaven," it may not describe an arrival, but a return, a restoration of order after chaos. And if kingship could descend, it could also depart. The flood then becomes not just an ending, but the moment when that sacred order was withdrawn. One wonders whether the Sumerians sensed this withdrawal. Perhaps that is why their myths are filled with longing. Gods who regret, who retreat, who send dreams but never answers. It is as though they stood in the aftermath of a forgotten covenant, remembering not through faith, but through record. Their gods were administrators, but their nostalgia was human. The temple hymns of Enheduanna, the priestess of and daughter of Saigon of Akkad, written centuries later, echo this ache. She writes of Inanna as both radiant and cruel, present yet unreachable. "You are the light of heaven," she says. "But who can approach your heart?" In her words, the divine has already shifted from embodied ruler to absent force. Civilization had matured, but the intimacy was gone. The clay tablets had outlasted the presence they described. If the King's List preserves anything, it may be this, the memory of a time before distance. In its quiet numerals and dry enumerations lies a deeper emotion, grief, for something vast that was once known and has been lost. And that loss is not only theological, it is existential. The flood, the shortening of rains, the descent that becomes legend, all of it speaks to a world where time itself fractured. The gods who ruled for 36,000 years are gone, and in their place stand men who rule for 60. Civilization continues, but the threat to eternity has been severed. In this light, the King's List is not a chronicle of power, but a eulogy for permanence. It reminds us that time was once infinite, that the ancients lived not by the clock, but by cycles that stretched beyond generations. Today, we live compressed lives measured in seconds. To the Sumerians, time was a vast landscape. To us, it is a narrow corridor. Perhaps that is why their myths seem alien. They remembered what it meant to live inside eternity. And yet, even in our modern disbelief, their memory persists. We still search the sky for origins, still measure epochs by celestial movement, still tell stories of floods and rebirth. The scientific names have changed, but the longing remains. We call it evolution, entropy, cosmology. But beneath those terms lingers the same question. Where did order come from? When kingship descended from heaven, was it metaphor or memory of a pattern that still governs us? Every civilization, it seems, repeats the same arc. Divine order, ascent, hubris, collapse, rebirth. The Sumerians merely recorded it first, and perhaps what they left us was not a record of the past, but a mirror of the future. If this pattern is true, then we too stand somewhere upon that spiral, far from the source, but still caught in its rhythm. The flood they feared may not have been of water, but of forgetting, a deluge of time that drowns meaning beneath repetition. To remember, then, is the only resistance. Maybe that is why their words, etched in fragile clay, still endure when marble statues crumble and digital archives fade. The King's List is not a relic of superstition. It is a meditation on transiencies. Its impossible numbers are not errors. They are symbols of reverence, attempts to quantify the immeasurable. To speak of kings ruling for 250 on 200 years is to acknowledge that the divine once lingered longer than we can now imagine. And so we return to that first line again, and again as though reciting a prayer when kingship descended from heaven. Each repetition draws us nearer to something we do not yet understand. An inheritance buried not in the soil of Mesopotamia, but within our own need to remember. What if beneath the literal and the mythic, the King's List preserves the oldest truth of all? That civilization did not begin once, but many times, and that each age forgets the last until a fragment, a tablet, a whisper in clay, reminds us. Perhaps what we call history is only one layer of a far older palace, and somewhere beneath the first handwriting of God still waits to be read. In every retelling of origins, there is always a missing line, a space where something sacred was erased. The Sumerian Kings List, for all its detail, carries that absence like a scar. It names kings, cities, and durations with care. Yet behind its order lies an unspoken question. Who recorded the first reigns and why? The earliest copies we possess were carved long after the events they describe. To call them records is to forget that memory itself can be an act of reconstruction. What if the King's List is not the first history, but the echo of an older one rewritten each time civilization rose from its own ashes? In Sumerian cosmology, the gods did not merely create, they delegated. They distributed power in layers. Ainu in the heavens, Enlil in the winds, Enki in the waters below. Each ruled a domain, and their union produced order. The King's List mirrors that structure. Its succession from city to city feels less like political transfer than like ritual enactment. As if kingship were a divine current moving across the land. Eridu, Bedabira, Larak Sipper, Sharupak. Each city rises, shines briefly beneath divine favor, and falls only for another to inherit the mantle. The rhythm is almost musical. Descent, rise, flood, renewal. It is tempting to read these as mere myths of transition. The poetic Waerli peoples explained shifting centers of power. But when archaeologists mapped these cities, something curious emerged. Each lay near a water source that had changed course over time. The ancient rivers of Mesopotamia, the lifeblood of civilization, were restless. Floods, droughts, and shifts in the Tigris-Euphrates delta periodically transformed the landscape. Cities rose where the rivers blessed them and fell when the waters turned away. To the ancients, this was not geology. It was theology. The gods, they believed, had withdrawn their favor, but perhaps they were simply describing the language of nature, the divine speaking through the movement of water and silt. Still, one wonders, Why record such cosmic time scales? Why frame the fall of cities as part of a celestial pattern? The answer may lie in how the Sumerians understood knowledge. To them, wisdom was not invention but remembrance. The divine decrees of civilization, writing, law, weaving, kingship, music, were said to have existed from the beginning. They were not created, they were recovered. Enki's myths tell of these powers being distributed to humankind as if civilization itself were a form of inheritance. The King's List, in this sense, is a record of that transmission. Each descent of kingship marks another release of divine order into the mortal realm, another fragment of heaven entrusted to clay and blood. And yet, by the time the list was written, the Sumerians already lived in the shadow of forgetting. Their cities had been built and rebuilt, their myths reinterpreted by empires that rose after them. Perhaps the tablet's most haunting quality is its calm tone. It never mourns what was lost, though loss is everywhere within it. Each new beginning is recorded without lament, as if resignation itself had become part of the rhythm of history. The flood comes, the kingship moves, and life begins again. Modern scholars bound by the frameworks of chronology often strip these stories of their symbolic depth. They measure, carbon date, translate, and catalog, but seldom listen. They see mythology where the ancients saw continuity. But to read the King's List with modern eyes is to miss its true nature. It is not a document about the past, but a meditation on recurrence. Its enormous spans of years do not mock reason. They gesture towards something the Sumerians felt, but could not define. That history repeats, not in detail, but in essence. That the rise and fall of kingdoms mirrors the breathing of the cosmos. Perhaps that is why so many ancient traditions, distant from one another in geography and language, share the same archetype. A primordial order descending to earth, followed by corruption, a flood, and a new beginning. In the Vedic Yugas, in the Egyptian Tepi, in the Hebrew Eden, the pattern endures. Each speaks of an age when gods and men shared the same horizon, followed by a rupture that sent humanity into exile. These are not coincidences of imagination, but reflections of a common memory, a trauma buried so deep that it resurfaced in every myth as metaphor. The King's List may be the first written form of that grief. And if this is so, what does it reveal about us? For in every retelling, humanity is both heir and exile, entrusted with fragments of divine wisdom, yet doomed to lose them. The Sumerians perhaps were already aware of this cycle. Their kingship was never permanent. It was borrowed. Their cities, no matter how glorious, were built upon the ruins of others. Eridu was once called the first city. Yet even it was built atop older settlements, now lost beneath layers of time. The farther archaeologists dig, the more it seems that the Sumerians were not the beginning, but the remembrance of a beginning. The tablet itself becomes a metaphor for civilization. Fragile, incomplete, yet enduring. Cracked along its edges, words missing, names eroded, it still speaks. The silence between its lines is as revealing as the text itself. One can almost imagine the scribe, seated in dim lamplight, tracing wedge after wedge into wet clay, aware that he was inscribing not truth, but inheritance. perhaps he too did not fully understand what he was preserving. Perhaps he only knew that it mattered. When we read those words today, we inherit that same act of faith, the belief that meaning can survive distance, that even the most ancient voices still carry resonance. The King's List may not tell us what happened, but it tells us what the ancients believed was worth remembering. And belief, in the end, is another form of truth. In the centuries that followed, empires would rise upon the same soil: Akkad, Babylon, Assyria, each declaring itself the new bearer of kingship. Each in turn would fall. Yet the pattern persisted, echoing through temples and chronicles: descent, rule, flood, renewal. Perhaps what the Sumerians called kingship was not political power at all, but consciousness, the awareness of order, of connection between heaven and earth. And perhaps what they feared losing was not territory, but alignment. If that alignment once existed between human order and cosmic rhythm, then its loss would feel like exile indeed. The flood in that sense becomes more than myth. It is the collective memory of disconnection. The King's List then becomes both a memorial and a compass, a way of tracing our return. We stand, like the Sumerians once did, amid ruins of our own making. Fragments of knowledge, broken records, forgotten names. We too build and rebuild, certain of our progress, yet haunted by the sense that something essential has slipped away. Perhaps that is the true legacy of the King's List, the reminder that even in the act of remembering, we are already forgetting. And yet, as long as the clay endures, as long as we read the words and wonder, the thread remains. The flood may erase cities, but not the hunger to understand what came before. And so once more the story begins, when kingship descended from heaven. There is a strange irony buried within the Sumerian Kings List, that a civilization so ancient, so aware of impermanence, would choose clay as the medium of its memory. Clay is humble. It cracks, it crumbles. It bears the fingerprints of the one who shapes it. And yet, unlike parchment or paper, it endures. Fire, which destroys most things, only hardens it. Perhaps that is why the Sumerians trusted it. They knew that memory, to survive, must sometimes be broken first. Every fragment we uncover today, chipped incomplete, yet still legible, is a testament to that paradox. What endures is never the whole but the remnant. When the scribes etched their lines into wet clay, they were not merely documenting events. They were performing a ritual of remembrance. In the dim flicker of oil lamps, beneath the steady hum of night insects, they inscribed the rhythm of kings and floods, of descent and renewal. To write was to participate in creation itself. Words were not symbols but vessels. The Sumerians believed that to name a thing was to keep it alive. And so, as they pressed those marks into the earth, they were not only recording history, they were preserving the pulse of the cosmos. It is easy from our modern vantage to treat such beliefs as quaint. We imagine ourselves far removed from the mythic mindset. Yet in truth, every archive, every database, every photograph is a continuation of the same instinct, the refusal to let time erase. We too make our own tablets of clay, only now the clay glows, and still beneath the data, the same fear lingers. That memory is fragile, that the story of what we are can disappear. The King's List, with its divine reigns and impossible numbers, carries this fear and this faith intertwined. Its kings are not characters but functions, embodiment of continuity. When one reign ends, another begins. Never from rebellion, always from descent. There are no revolutions in the King's List, only transitions. The divine order may move, but it never dies. Even the flood cannot destroy it. It only pauses the rhythm. When the waters recede, the descent happens again. To the Sumerians, this was reassurance that chaos, however vast, could never erase the pattern written into creation. And yet there is melancholy in that order. For what is constancy without presence? The gods who once ruled had withdrawn. Kingship descended, but the divine no longer walked among men. The clay remembers what flesh cannot. A time when the heavens were near. This yearning permeates all of Mesopotamian myth. In the story of Adapa, the wise priest of Eridu, man comes close to immortality, but turns away at the last moment, deceived by divine caution. In Gilgamesh, the hero journeys to the ends of the world, seeking eternal life, only to find that it belongs to no mortal. Again and again, humanity reaches upward only to touch absence. Perhaps this is why the King's List begins not with a creation myth, but with rule. Creation, in Sumerian, thought was incomplete without order. The world existed, yes, but it was ungoverned, a chaos of waters and wind. Kingship was the bridge that connected the two realms, transforming existence into civilization. To rule, then, was a sacred duty, not a privilege. The first kings were not conquerors, but mediators between heaven and earth. Their reigns were measured not by wealth or conquest, but by alignment, how well they preserved the balance between divine law and earthly life. As time went on, that alignment weakened. The divine kings became mortal. The sacred office became inheritance, and the language of power replaced the language of reverence. The King's List preserves this decline with quiet dignity. Its tone never shifts, but the pattern reveals everything. Each reign shorter than the last, each flood a little closer, each memory dimmer. Civilization advances, but divinity recedes. It is the oldest tragedy written into history that progress demands forgetting. We can see echoes of this descent even in later cultures. The Egyptians spoke of Tepi, the first time when gods ruled among men, a memory so ancient that even they, the builders of pyramids, called it myth. The Greeks imagined a golden age that ended in iron. The Hebrews remembered Eden. The Vedas spoke of Satya Yuga, all reflections of the same wound. Humanity carries within its myths the grief of separation. The Sumerians were simply the first to carve it into stone. And still there is something profoundly human in their hope. For though the divine departed, they did not despair. They built temples aligned with the stars, as if to mirror heaven upon earth. They mapped constellations, tracked the dance of Venus, and watched the heavens as though waiting for kingship to descend again. Even their mathematics, based on the number 60, reflected their sense of cosmic harmony, a geometry of eternity. In their calendars, their rituals, and their architecture, they woo memory into matter. There is a quiet lesson in that. The Sumerians did not fight against forgetting. They built within it. They accepted that floods would come, that empires would fall, that memory would fracture. But they trusted that fragments could still speak. Their wisdom lay not in preserving everything, but in preserving enough. A single tablet buried in mud would one day be enough to remind the world that gods once ruled. Today, when archaeologists uncover those tablets and brush the dust away, they repeat that ancient act of descent. They retrieve not only clay but continuity. Each wedge mark is a heartbeat from an age that refused to vanish entirely. It is as if the earth itself conspired to keep those words safe, protecting them beneath layers of silt, waiting for another civilization to remember. And we reading them now become part of that chain. The King's List is no longer merely Sumerian. It belongs to all who wonder where the first story began. Its message transcends the tablets. That history is not a line but a rhythm. That what has been lost will always find a way to surface again. In that sense, perhaps the flood was never punishment, but renewal. The waters washed away names, but not memory. The clay broke, but the words endured. And in each age that follows, kingship, whether of gods, of men, or of ideas, descends again, briefly, illuminating the earth before vanishing once more into silence. If so, then the story of the King's List is not finished. It is still unfolding. Every rediscovery, every translation, every whisper of curiosity about its meaning is another descent. For as long as we remember that line, when kingship descended from heaven, the connection remains unbroken. And perhaps that is what the Sumerians always intended. Not for us to believe, but to listen, to feel across thousands of years. The echo of a world where time itself was sacred and memory was the only bridge between gods and men. The Sumerian Kings List does not speak of creation. It speaks of order emerging out of silence. Before the first city, before the first brick, there was a rhythm that held the world together, a cadence that the Sumerians called me. These were not laws in the human sense, but cosmic principles, harmony, justice, artistry, kingship, truth. To possess the MI was to align oneself with the divine structure of the universe. Perhaps that is why kingship was said to descend from heaven rather than rise from the earth. It was not born of ambition but of resonance. A ruler did not seize power. He received it because he reflected the order of heaven. To the Sumerians, civilization was a mirror of the cosmos. The temple was not merely a house of worship, but a replica of the universe. Its foundations rooted in the underworld, its roof touching the heavens. The king standing at its center was the axis between worlds. But this image of balance contains a quiet fragility. For if the king failed to uphold harmony, the connection between realms would falter. And if that thread were broken, chaos would rise again. In this way, the King's List can be read not only as chronology, but as theology, a warning encoded in history. When we read that Alulim ruled for 2,800 years, or that Algar ruled for 36,000, we are not meant to imagine endless calendars, but perfect reigns, spans of unbroken harmony. Their length signifies not time, but completeness. Then comes the flood, a breaking of alignment. It is as though the rhythm faltered, the music of the spheres fell out of tune. The gods withdrew, the world changed key, and kingship, though it descended once more, no longer carried the same resonance. The numbers that follow shrink drastically, not because humanity learned to count differently, but because the sacred rhythm had shortened, time itself had diminished. In that sense, the King's List describes not the passing of eras, but the contraction of eternity. The ancients felt time as breathing, long, slow, cosmic. We feel it now as acceleration. Their thousands of years were not exaggeration but reflection of a different kind of existence. One stretched between heaven and earth. When the flood came, that breath quickened. History began and eternity retreated. The flood then becomes more than catastrophe. It is the first boundary. Before it, the divine and mortal intertwined freely. After it, the line is drawn. Humanity gains awareness but loses communion. Every myth echoes this paradox. Knowledge as both gift and exile. In the Sumerian story of Enki and the creation of man, humans are formed to serve the gods, to carry the labor of maintaining the world. But in serving they learn, and in learning they begin to imagine themselves apart from their makers. It is a quiet rebellion that will repeat across mythologies. Prometheus stealing fire, Adam tasting knowledge, Gilgamesh reaching for immortality. Always the same yearning to return to what was lost, to grasp again the divine current. Yet perhaps the King's List hints that this desire was not rebellion, but memory. Humanity was not born ignorant, but forgetful. The descent of kingship was the descent of remembrance, the reawakening of an ancient order that the flood had buried. Each new city, Eridu, Bad Tabira, Uruk, was an attempt to rebuild the bridge. Each ritual, each ziggurat, was an echo of the first alignment. Civilization then becomes not progress, but reconstruction, an endless effort to recall what once was whole. Archaeology confirms traces of this yearning. Beneath the dust of southern Mesopotamia, the earliest temples align precisely with celestial markers. The White Temple of Uruk was positioned to follow the movement of Venus, the planet of Inanna, whose cycles were tracked with mathematical precision millennia before classical astronomy. These alignments were not decoration. They were acts of restoration. By aligning the architecture of Earth with the rhythm of the sky, the Sumerians sought to reopen the channel between heaven and the mortal realm. To build was to remember. Even their myths of creation reflect this architectural faith. In the legend of Inanna and Enki, the goddess travels to the Abzu, the subterranean palace of wisdom, and returns with the Mai, bringing to humankind the arts, the laws, and the mysteries of civilization. It is a myth of transmission, not invention. The Sumerians did not claim to have created knowledge. They claimed to have recovered it. The me was eternal, merely rediscovered in each new age. And so the King's List, which tracks the descent of kingship, mirrors that descent of knowledge, the eternal return of wisdom through mortal vessels. What makes this idea haunting is its humility. It implies that humanity does not own civilization, but borrows it. That each age inherits fragments of order, holds them briefly, and then loses them again. It is a vision of history as tidal motion, descent, embodiment, decay, return. To modernize, this might seem fatalistic. Yet there is deep serenity in it. For in such a worldview, nothing is ever truly lost, only submerged, waiting to surface again. When kingship descended again after the flood, it did not return to Eridu, the first city, but to Kish. This change is subtle but profound. Eridu was the city of Enki, the god of the deep waters of wisdom and creation. Kish, by contrast, stood upon higher ground, the first city to rise from the flood silt. The shift marks a new relationship between heaven and earth, not one of intimacy but distance. The gods no longer dwell among men. They rule through intermediaries. The sacred becomes administrative. Divine rule becomes dynasty. The era of myth gives way to history. It is no coincidence that writing itself emerges soon after. To write is to preserve what can no longer be directly known. The Sumerians, in inventing cuneiform, may have been responding to absence, creating a medium through which memory could survive without presence. The tablet replaces the voice. The symbol replaces the divine word. In this way, every mark of progress carries within it a trace of loss. And so, as the King's List moves from gods to men, from eternity to years, it also moves from voice to text, from living memory to inscription. We may call this advancement, but the Sumerians might have called it survival. For what is writing, if not an attempt to bridge the flood within the mind? Even now, as we translate their signs and marvel at their sophistication, we are enacting the same ritual. We too read the grooves in clay, as if they contain more than words, as if they still vibrate with the echoes of the first descent. Perhaps they do, for memory, like clay, holds impressions long after the hands that shaped it are gone. The King's List ends where it began, with dissent. It does not explain. It does not justify. It simply reminds. It asks no faith and offers no conclusion. It only holds open the possibility that what has come before will come again in forms we may not recognize. And maybe that is its quiet message to every age that rediscovers it. That civilization is not invention but remembrance. That kingship, whether divine or human, is not the beginning of order but its echo. The question is not whether the gods truly ruled for 400 years, but whether the pattern they left still rules us. For if kingship once descended, what is to say it will not descend again? Somewhere in the midst of the clay fragments, a pattern begins to reveal itself, not through what the King's List says, but through what it omits, the gaps, the missing names, the eroded numbers. They are not just losses of time, but intentional silences. The Sumerians, it seems, understood that truth could not always be written in full. What is unsaid often carries more weight than what is preserved. Between each line of kingship and flood lies a pause, the echo of something forbidden, something that could not survive translation from divine to human memory. Perhaps that is why in every version of the King's List, the reigns before the flood are described with impossible precision, while the names after are uncertain, inconsistent, fragmentary. It is as if the further humanity drifted from heaven, the less clearly it could remember. The pre-flood era stands like a mountain reflected on the surface of the water, perfect above, blurred below. Each later copy becomes less distinct, less sure of its source. The clay bears not only the history of kings, but the erosion of understanding itself. To modern historians, This loss of clarity marks progress. Myth giving way to fact. The divine replaced by documentation. But in the Sumerian worldview, the opposite may have been true. The past was not primitive. It was sacred. The more ancient a thing was, the closer it stood to truth. The flood did not cleanse the world of sin. It buried wisdom beneath the tide. What survived was not knowledge, but fragments of recollection, traces of something vast and radiant, refracted through the fragile lens of human limitation. It is tempting in reading these texts to think of the Sumerians as distant from us, as a vanished people dreaming in symbols we no longer share. Yet perhaps the King's List is less a record of their world than a reflection of ours. Every generation inherits a flood. Every age must rebuild its memory from what little remains. We too stand amid ruins of knowledge, piecing together broken stories of origins. The Sumerians looked backward across the flood. We look forward into oblivion. But the feeling is the same, that history is not a wall of certainty, but a field of echoes. When the archaeologists of the early 20th century uncovered the tablets at Nippur, they expected accounting records, inventories of grain, livestock, tribute. What they found instead was a cosmology disguised as bureaucracy. The King's List looked like an administrative ledger, yet its arithmetic stretched into eternity. It was both myth and math, faith and formula. That duality unsettled scholars because it violated the modern categories of truth. To the Sumerians, there was no such division. Their history did not separate the measurable from the miraculous. The divine and the empirical were two languages describing the same reality. This is why the King's List continues to disturb us. It refuses to choose between religion and reason. Its impossible numbers cannot be dismissed as superstition. Yet, they do not submit to analysis. They stand in quiet defiance of our binary logic, suggesting that perhaps the ancients inhabited a world where myth was not fantasy, but memory shaped in metaphor. The Sumerians may not have meant to convince, only to remember. Their tablet is less proclamation than incantation, a chant against forgetting. Each repetition of descent, each record of flood and renewal was a reminder that what has fallen will rise again, though never in the same form, and perhaps that is the secret the King's List hides in plain sight. That time does not erase, it transforms. The gods who once ruled may no longer wear crowns of gold, but their presence lingers in other ways. In the architecture of thought, in the rhythms of power, in the very structure of civilization itself. Even now we live within the inheritance of their symbols. The 60-based system that governs our minutes and hours, the division of the circle into degrees, the first laws, the first written words, all descend from Sumer. We measure time as they did, though we no longer believe in what their numbers meant. Our days still turn on the same wheels, but the sacred meaning has been stripped away. The form remains. The spirit has fled. Perhaps that is what the King's List truly mourns. Not the loss of gods, but the loss of context. For what is civilization when it forgets why it was built? What is kingship without heaven above it? The list itself seems to ask these questions through silence. Its tone grows flatter, its poetry thinner, until by the final dynasties it reads like mere record-keeping. The divine flame reduced to ledger ink. The sacred becomes routine. The myth becomes administration. It is a descent not of kingship, but of meaning. And yet the list does not end with despair. It does not close with a final reign or apocalyptic vision. It ends abruptly, as if waiting. The last line trails off into nothingness, an unfinished sentence left for the future to complete. There is power in that incompleteness. It suggests that the descent may not be over, that kingship, or what it symbolizes, wisdom, balance, divine order, might descend again when humanity remembers how to look upward. In the ruins of Uruk, archaeologists once found a tiny tablet fragment older than any other copy of the King's List. Its wedge marks are faint, its surface worn smooth by millennia of earth and heat. The fragment ends mid-sentence on a phrase half lost to erosion. When kingship again descended, that single incomplete line feels like an invitation or perhaps a prophecy. The flood had passed, but memory was still returning grain by grain. Maybe the Sumerians understood something that we are only beginning to relearn. That the past is not behind us, but beneath us. Each age builds its cities atop the bones of the last. And beneath those stones lie not ghosts, but blueprints. The King's List is one such blueprint, a reminder that the cycles of forgetting and remembering are not failures, but the very rhythm of existence. We can choose to dismiss their long ages and divine kings as fantasy, or we can see them as symbols of something deeper, a truth about how order descends into chaos, and how chaos in turn births new order. The Sumerians may have wrapped their wisdom in myth, because myth endures where facts cannot. Fire and flood erase cities, but stories survive, and in those stories, the echo of the first descent never fully dies. So perhaps the tablet's greatest secret is not what it tells us about the past, but what it whispers about the present. That the flood is always coming, and kingship, in whatever form it takes, is always waiting to return. Among all the tablets unearthed in Mesopotamia, few inspire both reverence and unease like the Sumerian Kings List. Its wedge-shaped inscriptions are calm, measured, deliberate. Yet beneath their symmetry lies a tremor, as if the writer knew he was tracing something not meant to be forgotten, but perhaps not meant to be fully known either. The more one studies it, the clearer it becomes that this is not a text of mere remembrance. It is a veil. What it conceals may not be lies, but truths too vast for words, memories that had to be disguised to survive the long erosion of time. Every civilization, when it begins to write, must decide what to forget. The King's List seems to acknowledge this choice openly. By reducing the divine to numbers, by converting reigns of light into years of rule, it translates mystery into record. The gods who once walked the earth are converted into data. Yet the very act of calculation preserves them. In turning memory into mathematics, the Sumerians ensured that the presence of the divine would persist, hidden in plain sight, encoded within time itself. When kingship descended from heaven, what did that truly mean? The phrase has been recited so often that it risks losing its strangeness. But if we strip away the modern habit of metaphor, we face a deeper question. Did the ancients believe that heaven was a place or a state of being? To them, the sky was not a void, but a structure layered, inhabited, alive. The stars were the writing of the gods. Their slow procession across the night sky, a kind of eternal script. To say kingship descended from heaven was to say that order descended from the stars. That the same intelligence shaping the cosmos was reflected in the structure of human rule. In this sense, the Sumerian worldview was neither superstition nor science. It was synthesis. The divine was not an idea apart from nature, but the consciousness within it. The descent of kingship was therefore not intervention, but synchronization, the harmonizing of the human with the celestial. Civilization began not because men sought power, but because they sought alignment. There is evidence that this harmony was not merely symbolic. Many of the earliest Sumerian temples were built according to astronomical principles. Their corners aligned with solstices and equinoxes. Their proportions mirrored cycles of Venus, Jupiter, and the moon. This was not coincidence. It was as though architecture itself was a form of prayer. Geometry as devotion. In their walls of mud, brick, and alabaster, the Sumerians inscribed not only their gods, but the mathematics of the heavens. To build was to participate in the rhythm of creation. But over time, that rhythm faltered. The King's List charts its decline quietly. Without judgment, the vast reigns of the pre-flood kings shrink to human scale. The tone of the text does not change, but its spirit does. The divine presence grows distant. The kings become administrators rather than mediators. Men of dust recording their own impermanence. The language of eternity gives way to the language of law. In that transition, something immeasurable is lost. Not power, but proximity. The flood that divides the eras may symbolize that very loss. It is less an act of destruction than an act of separation. The world before the flood was one of unity. The world after one of boundaries. And yet, through that boundary, the memory of unity still seeps. The King's List becomes a bridge, a narrow thread connecting two orders of being. Its writers knew they could not restore what had been, but they could remember its pattern. They could keep the door slightly ajar. What makes the King's List so enduring, perhaps, is that it speaks in symbols both precise and porous. The number 24 and 200, the total years of the divine reigns, has provoked endless speculation. Some see in it coded cycles of procession, astronomical harmonics, or the turning of cosmic ages. Others dismiss it as exaggeration. But the Sumerians were not careless with numbers. Their mathematics was sacred. To them, the act of counting was an invocation. The number was not random. It was a key, a frequency. What it opened may never be proven, but the persistence of its mystery is itself a kind of truth. There is another layer to this. In Sumerian myth, memory and language were gifts guarded by the god Enki, the keeper of wisdom in the depths. The written word, they believed, was a divine technology, powerful, dangerous, capable of summoning as well as preserving. The King's List written in this sacred medium would thus be more than documentation. It would be a vessel of energy. Each name, each measure was a call to remembrance. To read it aloud was to awaken echoes of the first kings, to participate in the rhythm of their descent. One wonders, then, whether the Sumerians truly thought the gods had vanished, or whether they believed those presences still watched, waiting for the right alignment to return. The flood may have been not an end, but a curtain, a division of realms, thin but absolute. Through that veil, memory became the last form of communion. To remember was to keep the gods alive. And perhaps that is why the King's List feels strangely timeless. It is not addressed to its own era, but to any era that listens. It speaks across thousands of years without voice, carried only by the persistence of clay and the curiosity of those who rediscover it. Every time it is read, the descent happens again, not as miracle, but as remembrance. We like to think of ourselves as separate from such mythic thinking. Yet even now, our sciences chase the same questions under different names. We map the stars, searching for the origins of order. We measure cosmic background radiation the way the Sumerians once measured the movement of Venus. We speak of evolution, of entropy, of universal law. But what are these if not new versions of the same longing? The desire to know where kingship came from and whether it might descend again. The Sumerians were the first to give that longing shape, to carve it into something that could survive them. Their King's List is not a monument to the past, but a warning to the future, that every age of reason will forget its divine source, and every flood of forgetting will demand a new remembering. The cycle cannot be broken. It can only be traced again and again in clay, in stone, in thought. Perhaps that is the true flood, not water, but time. It comes for every civilization, washing away names and crowns, eroding certainty until only fragments remain. Yet the fragments endure. They call out from beneath the silt, whispering the same refrain that began it all when kingship descended from heaven. In those 5 words lies everything: the ascent and the fall, the remembrance and the forgetting, the endless rhythm between the human and the divine. To read them is to be reminded that history is not a straight road, but a circle drawn in dust, waiting for the next hand to trace it once more. Every civilization carries within it a moment when myth and history part ways. A quiet fracture that begins not with rebellion or revelation, but with language itself. For the Sumerians, that moment may have been the very act of writing the King's List. Before that, memory lived in song, in ritual, in the unbroken rhythm of oral tradition. Once pressed into clay, it became static, immortal, but also incomplete. To preserve something is to remove it from life. To name it is to fix it in place. And so, the Sumerians, in their devotion to memory, also sealed their myths inside time. The divine became history, and history over centuries became dust. Yet the clay tablets never truly died. They waited silent beneath the soil until the earth itself grew curious again. When they were finally unearthed, the first archaeologists were baffled by the names and numbers they found. 36,000 years of rule, 241,000 years before the flood. It seemed absurd. But the more they compared the tablets, the more they realized the consistency was no accident. Even the oldest fragments echoed the same impossible arithmetic. Something was being remembered, something too old to fit within the framework of accepted time. This is what gives the King's List its power. It resists interpretation. It cannot be entirely myth because it is too systematic. It cannot be entirely factual because it is too vast. It hovers between worlds like a relic of a consciousness that no longer exists. One that did not yet separate imagination from record, nor the divine from the real. To read it today is to glimpse a mind that saw the universe as alive, where the cosmos itself was a chronicle. And perhaps that is what the phrase kingship descended from heaven truly means. That order itself was the first revelation. The Sumerians did not begin with chaos. Their world began with structure, as though the first act of creation was not birth, but governance. Even the gods in their myths hold council and decree laws before shaping the earth. The King's List simply extends this theology into time. To the Sumerians, history was not a sequence of events, but a reflection of cosmic law. Time itself was administrative sacred bureaucracy written into the fabric of being. In this way, the flood takes on new meaning. It is not just punishment or disaster, but a recalibration. When harmony breaks, the world resets. Kingship must descend again to restore the balance. The divine does not abandon creation. It intervenes through rhythm. Floods in that sense are not endings. They are intervals between breaths. When we read of the pre-flood kings, Alulim, Alalgar, Enman, Luana, we are not reading biography, but melody. Each reign is a note in a cosmic song, its duration proportional to its perfection. The unimaginable length of their rule are symbols of resonance. These were ages in which the human world was still tuned to the frequency of the divine. After the flood, the music shortens, quickens, fragments. Civilization becomes louder but less harmonious. The tempo of existence accelerates. In a way, that acceleration continues still. The Sumerians lived within cycles that spanned millennia. We live within seconds. Their kings measured time in the lifespan of cities. Ours measure it in political terms, in data points, in market years. Yet beneath our speed, the old rhythm remains faint but constant. We still speak of eras of golden ages, of dark ages and renewals. We still sense that time moves not in lines, but in circles. The King's List is the first written reflection of that intuition, that history is not progression, but repetition refined. But repetition, too, has purpose. Each cycle descends with variation, carrying traces of the last, but never duplicating it fully. The Sumerians may have sensed that the descent of kingship was not a single miracle, but an ongoing process. The periodic return of awareness of alignment. To them the gods were not jealous deities but currents of intelligence. They could retreat, but never truly vanish. Their influence lingered into law, in art, in the architecture of the mind. Even when the heavens fell silent, their order persisted in the way the stars moved, the rivers bent, the seeds sprouted. Perhaps that is why the Sumerians never feared the flood. They accepted it as the cost of renewal. In their understanding, creation itself depended on alternation, descent and withdrawal, revelation and silence. The King's List, then, is less a chronicle of events than a guide to rhythm. It teaches that no age is final, that every fall is preparation for the next descent. That kingship, divine order, is never lost, only hidden. When the archaeologists brushed the dust from those tablets, they may have unknowingly participated in that same rhythm. For what is archaeology, if not a ritual of reawakening? The act of remembering what was once forgotten. Each excavation is a kind of descent, a journey into the underworld of time to retrieve fragments of light. And when those fragments are rid, the cycle completes itself. The old words live again, not through belief, but through awareness. We may not believe, as the Sumerians did, that kingship descends from the heavens. But we continue to seek meaning from above, from the stars, from patterns, from the unseen. Our satellites now orbit where their gods once did. Our instruments measure what their myths intuited. We map cosmic background radiation instead of divine order. Yet both serve the same impulse to locate ourselves within something infinite. The language has changed, but the longing remains. And so, perhaps the King's List survives, because it speaks to that longing better than any modern philosophy. It reminds us that civilization is fragile, not because it is mortal, but because it forgets. The flood is never truly water. It is amnesia, and kingship in whatever form it takes is remembrance. Each time we rebuild, each time we rediscover, we participate in the same divine rhythm. We bring order from chaos once more. That is why the tablet ends not with conclusion, but with anticipation. It does not declare that the age of kings is over. It simply stops mid-breath as though waiting for another flood, another descent, another generation of hands to lift the clay and remember. The Sumerians may have buried their gods in time, but they left the door open. And through that opening, all of history continues to flow. A tide of remembering and forgetting, eraser and return. The King's List does not belong to them alone. It belongs to every age that looks upon the ruins of its own creation and asks, who built the first city? Who ruled before the flood? And will they come again? Perhaps we're not meant to know the answer. Perhaps we were only meant to listen to that faint echo rising from beneath the silt of centuries, whispering the same eternal refrain when kingship descended from heaven. There is a peculiar stillness to the idea of the first city. When the Sumerians wrote of Eridu, they did not describe it as the beginning of civilization, but as a restoration, a reawakening after silence. The King's List begins there, not by accident, but because Eridu represented the moment when heaven and earth were once again connected. Kingship descended, the text says, and in that descent, the first temple was raised, the first measure drawn, the first song offered. It was not merely a place of governance, but a memory shaped into stone. In the mythology of Enki, Eridu was sacred because it stood upon the waters of the Abzu, the deep, the hidden source of creation. There wisdom itself dwelled. The earliest temple excavated at the site dating to around 400 B.C. is little more than a mound of mud and reed. Yet layer by layer the structure grows, rebuilt upon itself through the centuries, each generation adding new brick over the old. The result is not one temple, but a vertical memory. 17 iterations stacked atop one another, each echoing the same floor plan. To look down into its excavation is to look through time itself, through centuries of remembering and forgetting. The Sumerians did not abandon the past. They built upon it literally. This pattern of repetition and renewal lies at the heart of their worldview. The Kings List is its textual reflection. Each city receives kingship in turn, rises, falls, and passes it on. Eridu to Badtira, Badtira to Larak, Larak to Sippar, Sippar to Shuruppak, and then the flood. It is a perfect cycle, a rhythm of descent and dissolution. But after the flood, the list changes. Kingship no longer flows like a river. It jumps fractured from dynasty to dynasty, from one empire to another. The rhythm breaks, as though the pulse of heaven had grown faint. The Sumerians might have felt that something had gone wrong. That kingship, though it descended again, no longer found steady ground, and perhaps that is the tragedy hidden in their calm recordiping, the awareness of decline. Each successive reign shorter than the last marks not progress, but attenuation, a slow fading of connection. The numbers tell the story silently. The divine thousands become human decades. It is the mathematics of loss. Even so, the Sumerians did not despair. They turned their grief into ritual, into architecture, into law. They sought to recreate order through imitation. Every ziggurat built in later centuries, those stair-stepped mountains rising from the plains, was an echo of the first descent, a symbolic ladder between realms. The ascent of the priest was a reenactment of the moment when kingship came down from the sky. To climb was to remember. To offer was to reconnect, if only for a moment. The King's List in this light becomes more than an account. It becomes a ritual of writing. Each name inscribed upon clay was an invocation, a way to preserve resonance across the ages. When the scribe pressed his stylus into the soft earth, he was performing the same gesture as the builder of Eridu, shaping the formless into form. To write was to rebuild the temple of memory. It is no coincidence that the earliest known writing appears in Sumer at roughly the same time the King's List begins to take shape. For the Sumerians to write was to capture the divine pulse in matter. The written word, like the temple, was a vessel for descent. It is possible that the King's List was not originally meant to be read at all, not as a narrative, but as an object of power. The arrangement of names and numbers, the precision of its structure, the repetition of divine phrases, all suggest an incantation rather than a chronicle. In this way, the King's List may have served as both document and talisman. Its recitation could have been part of temple ritual, a yearly remembrance of divine order. Each generation reaffirmed the cosmic hierarchy by naming those who once ruled before the flood, invoking the pattern so that it would not vanish. For to forget the order of descent was to risk the return of chaos. Modern archaeology, in its hunger for facts, tends to strip such meanings away. We look for political history, dynastic succession, archaeological correlation. Yet the ancients saw no boundary between sacred and historical truth. To them, every record was both literal and symbolic. The King's List was not false, because its numbers were impossible. It was true because its rhythm was eternal, and that rhythm still haunts us. We see it in every rise and fall, every empire that builds its monuments atop the ruins of another. We call it history, but perhaps it is simply the same descent playing out in new forms. The flood may have passed, but its waters remain, rising invisibly through time. Each generation stands upon the silt of the last, thinking itself the first to build, the first to rule, the first to remember. The King's List whispers otherwise. It tells us that all beginnings are repetitions. When we look closely at Eridu's ruins today, there is nothing majestic left, only sun-baked clay, cracked foundations, scattered shards. Yet in those broken lines, the geometry of belief still lingers. The temple faced the rising sun. The walls were aligned with cardinal points, as though to anchor the cosmos to the earth. Even its smallest, bricks bear traces of human hands, the print of builders who labored not for glory, but for connection. To them, eternity was not an abstraction. It was something you could touch, soft, malleable, waiting to be impressed with meaning. Perhaps that is why the King's List continues to move us even now. It is not about kings or floods, but about the fragile persistence of faith. Faith in continuity, in the idea that order can return after chaos, that memory can survive the deluge. The Sumerians knew the flood was inevitable. They did not resist it. They prepared for it by writing. Their clay tablets were arks, carrying fragments of divine remembrance across the waters of time, and we millennia later have become their inheritors. Each time we unearth one of their tablets, we replay the same act of restoration. We pull their words from the mud, dry them in light, and read them aloud. And in that act, kingship descends again, not from the sky, but from the depths of the earth. The cycle completes itself quietly in museum halls, in whispered translations, in the touch of a fingertip tracing ancient marks. The flood did not erase them. It only buried them, waiting for us to dig. And so the question remains, not whether the Sumerians were right, but whether we still remember how to listen. For the clay has not stopped speaking. It still murmurs of divine descent, of cities that rose and fell like tides, of wisdom borrowed and lost. The King's List is its voice, patient and unhurried, waiting for the next age to hear. When kingship descended from heaven, perhaps it was not only the beginning of history, but the beginning of longing itself. The longing to return, to rebuild, to remember. The longing that even now shapes the way we look back at the dust and call it sacred. In the ruins of southern Mesopotamia, the wind still carries dust from the old riverbeds, a soft hiss like breath over forgotten words. To stand there is to feel time itself layered in silence. The reeds have long since withered. The waters have retreated. But beneath the cracked earth lie the memories of a world that once believed heaven could touch the ground. Every piece of clay that emerges from that soil seems to murmur the same refrain when kingship descended from heaven. It is strange, perhaps, that the first written civilization we know began not with stories of conquest or creation, but with a list. Yet there is wisdom in that choice. A list is both simple and profound. It orders chaos without pretending to explain it. The Sumerian Kings List does precisely this. It does not tell how the world began, nor why the flood came. It only arranges what remains, the way one might arrange relics after a disaster, trying to preserve what meaning can still be held. To write for the Sumerians was not to invent, it was to salvage. And so their first history reads like an act of mourning. Every name, every number feels like a eulogy for a lost world. The tablet does not celebrate glory. It documents endurance. It reminds us that civilization began not in triumph, but in recovery. Humanity, newly risen from the flood, did not look to the future, but to the memory of the gods. The act of naming the kings was in itself a ritual of gratitude, an acknowledgement that order had returned, even if only in shadow. But there is something haunting about the way the divine fades from the narrative. The early reigns are immense, their numbers unthinkable, their origin celestial. Then the flood sweeps over and the scales contract. The world becomes measurable, human. Kings now rule for decades, not millennia. Time itself seems to narrow, as though the very fabric of eternity were folding in on itself. What we call progress may have felt to the Sumerians like a decline, the dimming of a light once too bright for mortal eyes. This shrinking of time marks the beginning of history as we know it. Before, the past was vast and circular, unbounded by human life. After, it became linear, a procession of rulers, battles, years. The descent from heaven gave way to the ascent of men. Yet, even as the Sumerians accepted this new order, they could not forget what had been lost. Their myths, their rituals, their architecture, all were attempts to rethread the connection. They built ziggurats not as monuments of power, but as stairways of remembrance, layered echoes of the first descent. Each step, each offering was a petition to the sky. Remember us. To modern scholars, the King's List is a curiosity, an anomaly of exaggerated chronology. But to the Sumerians, it was revelation. It was proof that the divine once governed, that the laws of the cosmos had once been close enough to touch, that gods were not abstractions, but memories, embodied presences whose absence had to be endured. In that sense, the King's List is less a historical document than a spiritual diagnosis. It records not who ruled, but what faded. Perhaps that is why it continues to resonate across millennia. It speaks not only of kings, but of distance, of a longing older than religion, older even than writing itself. The longing to be near to meaning, to stand once more where heaven and earth were not separate. The Sumerians wrote their loss into permanence, and in doing so, ensured that future ages would inherit not their certainty, but their yearning. There is a passage seldom mentioned near the middle of one fragment. Then kingship descended again from heaven. It was established in Kish. The phrasing suggests interruption, a break and a return. It is not the first descent, nor the last. It implies that the cycle continues, that the flood, though devastating, was not the end. Something always returns. The King's List, for all its calm fatalism, contains within it an undercurrent of hope. The heavens may withdraw, but they never abandon. Archaeologists have traced the site of Kish, the city that rose after the flood. They found not splendor, but continuity. Tools, workshops, clay seals, modest temples. Life resumed with quiet pragmatism. The people rebuilt, recorded, planted. Civilization began again, not through miracles, but through memory. This, too, is a form of descent. The divine not as lightning, but as persistence. Perhaps that is the truest meaning of kingship, not dominance, but the steady will to remember. What fascinates most is how seamlessly myth and matter intertwine. The flood layers, uncovered by excavation, match, in part, the narrative breaks of the Kings List. A great sediment band dated around 900 BCE lies between two strata of habitation, as though the earth itself confirms what the tablet whispers, and yet even this scientific validation does not reduce the story to geology. Instead, it deepens it. The flood becomes both literal and symbolic, both water and oblivion, an event that cleanses, erases, and demands renewal. To the Sumerians, such duality was natural. The same flood that destroyed also fertilized. The same clay that buried the dead preserved the tablets. The same gods who withdrew left traces for the faithful to follow. The King's List is filled with these contradictions. Endings that are beginnings. Absence that preserves presence. It invites not certainty but contemplation. And perhaps that is why it feels so strangely modern. We too live amid floods of data, of information, of noise. We record endlessly yet remember little. We build higher towers, yet feel further from the heavens. The Sumerians would have understood this condition well. They too watched as memory scattered, as divine rhythm gave way to human haste. Their response was to write slowly, patiently into clay. They believed that even fragments, if preserved, could one day restore the whole. Maybe that is what we're doing still. Each discovery, each excavation, each translation is another attempt to reassemble what was lost. We may not call it kingship anymore, but the descent continues in subtler ways, in flashes of insight, in art, in the quiet persistence of wonder. The Sumerians would have recognized these as forms of remembrance, ways to align again with the order that once descended freely from the sky. The King's List ends where our own story begins, with the awareness that history is not a possession, but a dialogue, not a monument, but a mirror. The Sumerians wrote to remind themselves that all civilization is borrowed. That time itself belongs to the divine. What we call progress, they might have called repetition. What we call memory, they might have called prayer. When kingship descended from heaven, it was not only the beginning of rule, but the beginning of reflection. To remember is to rebuild, and perhaps that is the secret the Sumerians left buried in their clay. That as long as we continue to search, to dig, to listen, the descent will happen again, not in stone, nor in sky, but within the quiet chambers of remembrance, where the gods still speak in the language of dust. It is easy to forget that the Sumerian Kings List was not written once, but many times. Copies of it appear across centuries in Nippur or Lhasa, Babylon, each slightly different, each adjusted by the hand of time. Some versions are incomplete. Others reorder the names or shorten the reigns. Yet the essence never changes. Kingship descends, the flood intervenes, and kingship descends again. This constancy amid variation suggests something profound. The Sumerians were not recording a single event. They were reaffirming a pattern, one that extended beyond their lifetimes, perhaps beyond history itself. In that sense, the King's List may be the first document in human memory to treat time as cyclic rather than linear. It envisions history not as a march forward, but as a breath, an inhalation, an exhalation of divine order. Each age of kingship is an inhale, each flood an exhale, the pause between eras like the stillness between tides. And if this is so, then the list is not merely a record, but a map, one that charts the rhythm of civilizations as living organisms. Modern eyes struggle with this idea because we are trained to think of time as irreversible. But for the Sumerians, eternity was not an endless line. It was recurrence. To live after the flood was not to be separate from those who came before. It was to participate in the same descent under a different sky. Even the act of writing the Kings List was a kind of ritual repetition, a conscious reenactment of the original descent. To remember the pattern was to ensure it would happen again. This cyclical worldview permeates all Sumerian thought. Their gods did not create the world once. They maintained it through constant renewal. Their year was divided by festivals that reenacted cosmic events. The marriage of Inanna and Dumuzi, the victory of Enlil over chaos. Through these ceremonies, the people kept the cosmos alive. Ritual was memory made flesh. Writing was ritual made eternal. The King's List then stands as the highest form of devotion, the written memory of the universe remembering itself. But with every repetition, something shifted. The clay cracked. The language evolved. By the time Babylon inherited the legacy of Sumer, the gods had become more distant, the heavens more abstract. Kingship still descended, but now it did so through omens, through dreams, through divine right claimed by human ambition. The pure alignment of heaven and earth had been replaced by interpretation. And so began what the Sumerians might have seen as the long twilight, an age where symbols endured, but their meanings drifted. We see this transformation mirrored in the tablets themselves. The earliest inscriptions are dense with faith, rhythmic in their certainty. The later ones grow technical, almost bureaucratic. The wedge marks become sharper, the spacing more efficient, the reverence replaced by precision. The sacred had become administrative. Time, once a circle, began to flatten into a ledger. The divine descent had turned into the bureaucracy of history. And yet, the echo remains. Even in Babylon's most rational texts, the ancient pattern hums beneath the surface. Their astronomers tracked the cycles of Jupiter and Venus with mathematical perfection. But they did so not for curiosity, but for prophecy. Each movement of the heavens still carried meaning. Each alignment hinted that kingship might descend again. The stars, once the throne of the gods, had become instruments of prediction, but the longing remained unchanged. Humanity still looked upward, waiting. What is remarkable is how this longing survived even after the Sumerians vanished. It passed into Assyria, into Persia, into the Hellenistic world. It appears again in the myths of divine messengers, of promised returns, of golden ages to come. In every tradition, the same pattern endures: descent, flood, restoration. Whether in the tale of Atlantis, the fall of Eden, or the renewal of ages in Hindu cosmology, the echoes of Sumer ripple outward. The King's List may be their oldest written ancestor, the first articulation of the human hope that what was once divine might one day return. But perhaps the most haunting truth is that the Sumerians never claimed to understand why the pattern occurred. Their text contains no theology of sin, no explanation of the flood's purpose. The gods are neither cruel nor kind. They simply act. The flood comes and kingship descends again. The rhythm itself is divine. Explanation is irrelevant. In that humility lies a kind of wisdom we have long forgotten. They did not demand to know why the heavens withdraw. They accepted that the withdrawal itself is part of the descent. There is beauty in that restraint. It implies that mystery was not failure, but harmony. That uncertainty was an essential element of the sacred. The King's List does not try to impose meaning upon the unknown. It simply preserves its outline like a fossil of awe, and perhaps that is why it endures longer than empires. Certainties decay. Mysteries persist. Today, when scholars reconstruct the fragments of the list from museum shelves and excavation reports, they are unknowingly reenacting the same ritual as the ancient scribes. They too arrange broken pieces into order, bridging gaps with imagination, searching for the rhythm that binds the fragments together. In this sense, the modern scholar and the Sumerian priest are not so different. Both are participants in the same descent, both reaching through dust to touch a memory that will not die. One fragment from Lhasa ends abruptly, as though interrupted mid-thought. The kingship was taken to the heavens again. The sentence breaks off there. The clay crumbled at its edge. It is unclear whether this was an ending or an omission, but its placement feels deliberate. The phrase reverses the pattern. Kingship once descending now ascends. It suggests withdrawal, the moment when the divine departs, leaving the world to its own devices. Perhaps the scribe meant to capture not loss but completion. For what descends must eventually return. That fragment, like so many others, now rests behind glass, its marks barely visible under museum light. Visitors pass by unaware that they are standing before one of humanity's oldest reflections on time. The King's List sits quietly, its mystery unbroken, its power undiminished. It does not need to speak loudly. Its silence is enough. And in that silence lies a question that refuses to fade. If kingship once descended and once ascended, what rhythm are we living in now? Are we still waiting for another descent? Or are we already in the interval between breaths, the pause before remembrance begins again? The clay offers no answer. It never promised one. But its endurance is answer enough. Through flood and empire, through conquest and forgetting, it remains a shard of continuity, buried beneath our restless progress. When kingship descended from heaven, the words still echo, carried by dust and memory, whispering to anyone willing to listen that history, like clay, is not fixed, but soft, waiting always to be reshaped. Each age believes itself to be the first to awaken. Yet every awakening begins with something unearthed. The Sumerians knew this truth instinctively. They did not see themselves as inventors, but as rediscoverers, heirs to a wisdom buried beneath floods of time. Their King's List is proof of that humility. It does not claim creation, only continuation. When kingship descended from heaven, it begins as if to say, "We did not begin this story. We only remembered it." Perhaps that is why their civilization feels both ancient and familiar. In the fragments of their myths, we recognize our own questions, our same fascination with beginnings, our same fear of endings. The flood that separates their divine kings from the mortal ones is not just an event. It is a mirror. Every culture since has repeated that reflection. A paradise lost, a world renewed, an echo of something greater, receding into silence. The Sumerians were merely the first to write it down, but the longing belongs to all of us. It is remarkable how little their world has truly vanished. Their language, though long dead, whispers through our modern tongues, through the words we use for measurement, for order, for law. Their gods, renamed and redressed, wander through later mythologies. Enki becomes A in Babylon. Inanna becomes Ishtar. Anu becomes El. Their numbers linger in our clocks, their geometry in our architecture, their vision of cosmic hierarchy in our political systems. Even now, in the age of satellites and circuits, we still divide our days into 60 minutes, our circles into 360 degrees. The shadow of Suma persists in the mechanisms of modern time. And yet, for all that continuity, the soul of their vision eludes us. The Sumerians saw no conflict between heaven and earth. Science and spirit, measurement and mystery. To them, these were different names for the same truth. The King's List, with its impossible chronologies, embodies that unity. Its numbers are astronomical and sacred at once. They record not duration, but significance, the measure of harmony between divine and human realms. The reigns of the gods were long because their order was perfect. Ours are short because we have forgotten how to stay aligned. When we read the King's List now, it is tempting to treat it as a puzzle to be solved. Scholars calculate ratios, propose symbolic interpretations, search for correspondences with celestial cycles. But perhaps the point was never to solve, only to remember. The Sumerians wrote their truths in the language of paradox. They did not need us to believe that kings ruled for 30,000 years, only to understand what that number meant. A world so in tune with the divine that time itself flowed differently. In this light, the flood is not just destruction but dissonance. It is what happens when alignment breaks. When the song of the cosmos is interrupted, and the return of kingship, the second descent, is harmony restored. The world breathes again, though more faintly each time. Each new age remembers less, feels less, lasts less. The arc of history in the Sumerian sense is the story of fading resonance. But if history fades, it also returns. That is the paradox that underlies all their myths. The flood erases, but it also renews. Death clears space for descent. Even forgetting in their theology serves a purpose. For only when the vessel is emptied can it receive the next revelation. Civilization to them was not progress, but preparation. The long training of memory to welcome kingship once more. This idea runs through their rituals. Every new year, the priest reenacted the cosmic drama of descent and renewal. The king would be stripped of his crown, humiliated before the statue of the god, confessing his failures. Then, if the signs were favorable, the crown would be returned and order restored. It was a ritual memory of the flood, the temporary collapse of structure, so that it could be renewed. The Sumerians did not fear loss, they ritualized it. By repeating it, they mastered it. Modern civilization, by contrast, fears erasure. We build archives, digital clouds, monuments to permanence. Yet beneath our obsession with preservation lies the same anxiety that haunted Sumer. That memory can drown. That time can wash meaning away. Perhaps this is why the King's List feels so urgent even now. It reminds us that remembering is not about holding on, but about letting the pattern repeat. What endures is not the monument, but the rhythm. The Sumerians themselves eventually disappeared, absorbed into a Babylon Persia. Their temples crumbled. Their language dissolved into ununiform relics, and yet they succeeded in their most profound act of remembrance. Their story survived the flood of oblivion. We still speak of them. We still read their tablets. The clay did not lie. It waited. Sometimes late in the evening, when museum lights dim and the glass cases grow quiet, one can imagine the faint shimmer of those wedge marks as they catch the glow of the lamps, as if the words themselves still breathe. They do not shout their truth. They whisper it softly, persistently. That order can fall but not disappear. That time can fold but not end. That every civilization, no matter how advanced, lives under the same law of descent and flood. It is tempting to ask whether the Sumerians expected their own world to end, whether they saw the flood as a prophecy, not just a memory. The King's List gives no hint, but its silence feels deliberate. The text does not plead for survival. It assumes renewal. To the Sumerian mind, the fall of their cities would not be failure, but fulfillment. The pattern had to continue. What mattered was not how long kingship stayed, but that it would return. In that sense, their legacy is not tragedy, but patience. The patience of clay that endures until the next hand lifts it from the mud. The patience of stories that wait for new listeners. The patience of memory itself, which knows that forgetting is only a kind of rest. The flood, then, is not something to fear. It is part of the rhythm. Perhaps the Sumerians would look upon our world, our technology, our speed, our brilliance, and see not progress, but the approach of another tide. They would not despair. They would prepare the tablets. They would write again the same refrain, so that when the waters recede, the next civilization will remember. There was once an age when heaven touched the earth, when kingship descended from heaven. The phrase remains the oldest prayer we have, though we no longer recognize it as one. It is not a statement of faith, but a promise whispered through dust, that what has been lost will one day return, and that memory, though it may sink beneath the flood, never truly drowns. There is a certain quiet terror in realizing that the oldest story we possess is not one of beginning, but of loss. The Sumerian Kings List opens with descent, not creation, with something that comes down, not something that rises up. The world does not emerge, it remembers. Kingship, order, civilization, all are presented as inheritances from a greater realm, bestowed upon humanity rather than born from it. The first words of history are already about something that has ended. That perspective reverses everything we think we know about progress. To the Sumerians, the divine was not an ideal to be reached, but a condition to be restored. Human life began in alignment and drifted gradually into dissonance. The flood was not punishment. It was consequence, the natural collapse that occurs when the balance between heaven and earth decays, and after each collapse, kingship descends again, bringing with it a temporary harmony before the next forgetting begins. The King's List is not a record of a linear progress, but a pulse, a cosmic heartbeat recorded in clay. Perhaps that is why it feels so strangely timeless. Even now, in an age that claims to have moved beyond myth, we still sense the rhythm it describes. We rise, we fall, we rebuild. Each empire imagines itself eternal until the waters rise again. Not literal floods, but floods of change, of forgetting, of collapse. History may change its language, but its pulse does not. The Sumerians merely named what we continue to live, the oscillation between remembrance and amnesia. In their worldview, the gods did not withdraw out of cruelty, but necessity. Humanity could not bear the full weight of their presence. The long reigns of the first kings, tens of thousands of years, were not exaggerations, but expressions of unbroken intimacy with the divine. When that intimacy faded, so did duration. Time contracted as heaven receded. To live less long was to live further from eternity. Our brief lives, our hurried ages, are symptoms of separation. The flood, therefore, was not simply a cleansing of the earth. It was a closing of the distance between man and God. Water erases boundaries. It washes away distinctions. In the moment of deluge, all becomes one again. But when the waters withdraw, the world divides anew. Heaven above, earth below, memory severed from presence. The King's List records that moment of separation with astonishing restraint. No lamentation, no moral, just the quiet statement. Then the flood swept over. The brevity of the line feels like reverence, as if the event were too immense to describe. What followed was not despair, but renewal. Kingship descended once more, this time to Kish, the city of men. The sacred had returned, but transformed, now filtered through human frailty. The kings who followed were mortal, their reigns measurable. They ruled not by direct divine presence, but by reflection. They were shadows of the first light, and yet the Sumerians honored them as heirs of that original alignment. They built temples, performed rituals, copied tablets, all acts of remembrance meant to sustain the faint thread that still connected them to heaven. Archaeologists who uncovered these cities found that the Sumerians built not in isolation, but in conversation with their past. Beneath every temple lay the ruins of another, and beneath that another still, each generation built upward, not outward, stacking memory upon memory. The physical structure of their civilization mirrored their spiritual one, vertical, layered, recursive. Their world was a staircase rising towards something remembered but unseen. When we read the King's List now, it feels like that staircase carved into words. Each line, each reign, each repetition of descent and flood is another step in the endless climb between forgetting and remembrance. The Sumerians were not naive dreamers clinging to myth. They were engineers of memory. They knew that knowledge could vanish as easily as cities. Their writing, their rituals, their architecture, all were designed to outlast the inevitable. And so perhaps the King's List is not only a chronicle of ancient kings, but a manual for survival. It teaches that the divine cannot be held permanently, that floods will come, that memory will drown, but also that what is lost will always find its way back. The key is not to resist the flood, but to build the ark. For the Sumerians, the ark was not a boat. It was language. Clay was their vessel, and words were their salvation. Consider the audacity of that choice. To entrust eternity to mud, to write the cosmos into dust, and believe that one day someone, perhaps thousands of years later, would lift it from the earth and read. That faith, more than any theology, is what makes the Sumerian spirit immortal. They did not worship permanence. They worshipped recurrence. They trusted the cycle. They believed that memory, like kingship, always descends again. And indeed it has. The tablets, buried beneath centuries of sediment, waited patiently through empires and extinctions. When they were finally unearthed, they fulfilled their own prophecy. Kingship descended once more, not as power, but as knowledge. Through their recovery, a new connection between heaven and earth was formed, not divine, but intellectual. We who read their words under fluorescent light have become the inheritors of that descent. There is something humbling in that realization. The Sumerians built to remember, and we remember to understand. Yet our purposes are the same. We too fear the flood of forgetting. We too inscribe our truths into fragile vessels, hoping they will outlast us. Our tablets glow instead of harden, but the impulse is unchanged. Every archive, every database, every coded line of text is another attempt to resist erasure. We are still writing against the flood. But unlike the Sumerians, we rarely pause to feel the sacred weight of that act. They wrote slowly, with reverence, pressing each mark as a prayer. We write in haste, filling the void with noise. Perhaps that is why their words, though older than empires, still sound more enduring than ours. They understood that memory demands stillness, that to preserve truth, one must carve it into silence. The King's List is that silence made visible, a text that does not explain, does not argue, only endures. It asks nothing of belief, only of attention. It is a whisper across 5,000 years, reminding us that civilization is not built by conquest or invention, but by the courage to remember. When kingship descended from heaven, it was not only the beginning of the order, it was the beginning of care. To remember is to honor the fragile. To build knowing that it will break, to write knowing that it will fade. To love knowing that it will be lost. The Sumerians knew this. They accepted the flood, and still they wrote. That is the truest descent of all. If one listens closely to the rhythm of the King's List, one begins to sense that it's not only a record of rains, but a meditation on time itself. Not time as we measure it, but as the ancients felt it, vast, breathing, cyclical. To the Sumerians, time was alive, capable of remembering and forgetting, expanding and contracting with the pulse of heaven. Every king, every city, every flood was simply another inhalation, an exhalation of that cosmic rhythm. And in their writing, they tried to synchronize themselves to it, to capture eternity in the fragile shape of a wedge pressed into clay. The modern reader, standing at the far end of that rhythm, may find it difficult to feel what the Sumerians felt. We see time as a line, not a circle, a chain of cause and effect rather than a wave of return. But for them, nothing was ever lost. What descended would one day descend again. The gods might withdraw. The waters might rise, but order would always find its way back. The King's List was not nostalgia. It was reassurance. It was their way of saying, the flood is never the end. It is tempting to read the King's List as myth, but perhaps myth is only the name we give to truths too vast to prove. The reigns of 36,000 years may seem absurd, yet they convey something more real than numbers. The feeling of an age when time itself was slower, denser, closer to the eternal. When the divine was near, a single day could hold the weight of centuries. And when the divine withdrew, time shattered into fragments, scattering like shards of light upon the surface of the world. Some scholars have noticed that the great lengths of rule in the list seem to follow mathematical harmonics. Multiples of 60, the sacred number of Anu, the sky god. 60 was not chosen at random. It represented totality, the complete circle of heaven. To rule for 36,000 years, 660 was to embody cosmic perfection. The numbers are not history, but geometry. The pattern of divine order expressed through human imagination. And in that geometry lies the same logic that shapes the stars. The same pattern that governs our calendars. Still, the Sumerians did not invent mathematics to measure the world. They used it to converse with it. When the flood came, that conversation faltered. The world of men became louder, busier, but less attuned. The flood washed away not only cities, but coherence, and so began the long project of re-ranzation, of trying to recover the language that once bound heaven and earth. The King's List was their first attempt to remember that lost grammar. Every temple, every hymn, every measurement of time was a translation of silence into structure, a plea to restore the music of the cosmos. That music was not metaphor. The Sumerians believed the universe itself was sound. Vibration turned into matter, rhythm into form. To them, harmony was not an abstraction, but a physical law. A misaligned temple, a corrupt ruler, a broken covenant, all created dissonance that rippled through existence. The flood was the loudest of all those dissonances. The earth's way of restoring balance, by clearing the noise, to rebuild after it was to tune the world again. It is no accident that the earliest musical instruments known to archaeology, the lyres of the reed flutes of Lagash, come from the same soil that bore the King's List. Music was more than art. It was remembrance. Each note was a fragment of divine order, a faint echo of the harmonies that once ruled the world. Even the act of chanting the King's List aloud may have been melodic. A ritual performance, meant to restore balance through sound. To recite the names of the ancient kings was to make the air vibrate with their memory, to awaken the pattern hidden in dust. We who live in an age of constant noise have forgotten this sacred dimension of sound. To us, music is entertainment. To them, it was architecture, invisible temples built of rhythm. And so, the King's List too was music in its way, a composition of time, a score written for eternity's voice. When archaeologists first uncovered the Nippur tablet, its fragments seemed like static data. Yet, as translators pieced together its sentences, a strange coherence emerged. Despite gaps, the structure held. The sequence of cities, the proportions of rains, the placement of the flood, all followed a rhythm too deliberate to be coincidence. It was as if the clay itself remembered what the scribes could not. That quiet perfection suggests that the list was copied not merely from memory, but from something older, perhaps from an oral cadence, a liturgical rhythm preserved through generations of recitation, before it was ever pressed into clay. The first history may have been sung before it was written, and perhaps that is why it still feels alive. To read it is to feel the faint pulse of that original melody, a vibration carried across 5,000 years. The words themselves are simple, but their resonance is immense. When kingship descended from heaven, that opening line repeated across versions has the structure of an invocation. It does not inform, it awakens. There is a subtle beauty in how the Sumerians use language. Sparse, measured, almost mathematical. Each word had weight. There were no unnecessary adornments. Meaning was not explained but implied, allowed to expand in silence. They understood that the sacred cannot be captured directly. It can only be outlined, hinted at, allowed to echo. The King's List, in its restraint, achieves precisely that. It says almost nothing, yet contains everything. We live now in a world of abundance of words, data, information, and yet we understand less. Perhaps that is because knowledge without silence cannot become wisdom. The Sumerians balanced both the precision of record and the humility of mystery. Their writing system itself was a paradox. Rigid in form, fluid in meaning, every wedge, every mark could be read in several ways depending on context. The text never fixed truth. It invited interpretation. That openness is what allowed the King's List to survive so many centuries, adapting to new cities, new gods, new tongues. It was never dogma. It was living memory. And maybe that is its final lesson. The descent of kingship is not a moment in the past, but a motion of consciousness, a recurring alignment between human order and the greater order beyond. It happens whenever we remember the sacred rhythm beneath our chaos. Whenever we rebuild not from ambition, but from reverence. The Sumerians saw this truth not as religion, but as reality. And through the quiet endurance of their clay, they passed it on to us. When kingship descended from heaven, it was not only the start of civilization, but the first note of the world's song. And though the melody has changed, though floods have come and gone, its echo still hums beneath everything we build. If we learn to listen again, perhaps we will hear it faint, ancient, familiar, and know that the descent never truly ended. There is a strange comfort in realizing that the oldest civilization we know began not with certainty, but with remembrance. The Sumerians did not claim to know how the world began, only that something once existed, something radiant and ordered, and that its echo still shaped their lives. Their King's List was the record of that echo. It does not begin with creation, but with memory, a descent, a flood, and a return. Perhaps this is why it still resonates, because it understands that humanity's first story is not of beginnings, but of recoveries. Each generation of Sumerians inherited fragments of that memory and tried in their own way to translate it into form. they built cities along the shifting rivers, measuring their foundations by the stars. They raised temples to mirror the heavens, mapping constellations into clay. They believed that architecture itself could remember, that the shape of the city could echo the divine order that once ruled the world. In a sense, every wall, every tablet, every ritual was an act of archaeology, not discovery, but restoration. Modern archaeology performs a similar act in reverse. We dig down through the ruins they left, uncovering their attempts to rebuild what had already been lost. The deeper we go, the more we see that their longing was not so different from our own. They sought permanence in a transient world, meaning in repetition, clarity, and the flood of time. Their gods were not abstractions. They were the names they gave to order, to intelligence, to the strange precision of the cosmos. And in their writing, they tried to preserve a trace of that alignment. To read the King's List is to sense how delicate that preservation was. Each reign, each number feels balanced between faith and decay. The Sumerians knew that memory is perishable, that words can fade as easily as light, that history can drown as surely as cities, so they wrote as though writing were prayer, as though each mark in clay could call back what the flood had taken. Their devotion was not to belief, but to endurance. They could not prevent forgetting, but they could make forgetting take longer. It is difficult now to comprehend the scale of their patience. A Sumerian scribe might spend years learning the correct shape of a single sign, practicing the angle of each wedge until it matched the rhythm of heaven. Their script was not decoration. It was discipline. To write was to align oneself with cosmic order, to press harmony into clay. Each tablet was a fragment of balance, a quiet defiance of chaos. The King's List may have begun as a ritual chant, an oral tradition recited by priests before it was ever written down. One can imagine the slow cadence of its opening words spoken in the temple courtyard, the echo carrying through columns of baked brick when kingship descended from heaven. The phrase itself sounds like invocation. It was probably never meant to end, only to loop again and again as the story moved from the gods to men, from memory to forgetting. To speak it aloud was to remember the pattern, and remembering was a form of renewal. In the centuries that followed, new empires rose where Sumer once stood. Akkad, Babylon, Assyria, each inherited the language of the old world. Each reshaped it to fit its own gods and kings. But none of them erased the story of descent. They may have changed the names, shortened the reigns, shifted the numbers, but the rhythm endured. Even when they no longer believed the divine had walked among them, they still began their histories the same way, with a gift from heaven. That persistence is more revealing than belief itself. It suggests that what the Sumerians truly left behind was not religion, but memories, architecture, a way of arranging the unknown so it could survive the known. There is something profoundly human in that act. The flood, whether literal or symbolic, stands for everything that threatens to erase us. Nature, time, amnesia. The descent of kingship stands for everything that tries to rebuild. Order, consciousness, compassion. The two are inseparable. Without the flood, descent has no meaning. Without descent, the flood never ends. The King's List captures this duality perfectly. Loss and renewal, silence and song, chaos and memory, all woven into one continuous cycle. Perhaps that is why it continues to haunt us. In its sparse lines, we see the shape of every civilization that came after, including our own. We too live between floods. Our waters are different, not deluge, but data, not mud, but noise. Yet the danger is the same, that in our abundance of information, we may lose the thread of remembrance. We build higher towers than the Sumerians ever dreamed of, but we do not know if they are temples or monuments to forgetting. The flood no longer comes from the sky. It rises from within, and still the old rhythm persists. Every few centuries, kingship descends in new form, not as divine rulers now, but as bursts of understanding. Moments when the world briefly remembers its connection to something greater. The rediscovery of writing, the birth of philosophy, the awakening of science, the quiet revolutions of thought. Each is a descent of order into chaos, light into darkness. The cycle has not broken. It has only changed its language. It is tempting to imagine that the Sumerians foresaw this, that they knew every age would face its own flood, and that their clay tablets were not just records, but messages. Perhaps they wrote for us, the distant inheritors, who would one day dig through their ruins and wonder why they believed gods once ruled the earth. Perhaps they hoped that by preserving the rhythm, we might recognize it in ourselves. For though we no longer speak of heaven, we still feel the same longing, the sense that something higher once touched this world, and might. Again, to stand before one of those tablets in a museum is to feel that longing made solid. The wedge marks are small, imperfect, sometimes smudged by the hand that pressed them. And yet they have outlasted empires. Their silence speaks more eloquently than any monument. They whisper not of kings, but of time's refusal to forget entirely. The Sumerians did not need their gods to live forever. They only needed their memory to. That perhaps is why they wrote so patiently, not to preserve power, but to preserve rhythm. They trusted that someday, when the flood of forgetting had receded, someone would find their words again, and the descent would continue. And so here we are, thousands of years later, reading their story in the glow of artificial light. The flood has changed form, but the descent has not. The words still stand, fragile and immortal, carrying across ages the same whisper that once filled the air above the Euphrates when kingship descended from heaven. Perhaps the Sumerians were right all along. Perhaps what we call civilization is not the invention of mankind, but the memory of a descent that never ended. The slow remembering of a song we have always known faintly in the depths of our own silence. In the ruins of ancient Sumer, the earth still exhales stories. Each grain of dust seems to remember something older than itself. A vibration, a memory, a name half erased by time. Archaeologists brush away the soil layer by layer, uncovering walls, tablets, fragments of statues. But what they truly uncover is a pattern, the persistent desire of humanity to rebuild what was lost. Beneath the broken bricks of Uruk and Eridu lies not only the beginning of civilization, but the beginning of remembrance itself. The Sumerian Kings List stands at the center of that remembrance like a heartbeat frozen in clay. It does not glorify power. It does not celebrate conquest. It simply bears witness to the rhythm of rise and fall, of flood and descent. Its simplicity conceals its depth. To read it is to stand between two silences. The silence before the flood, when heaven and earth were one, and the silence after, when humanity began again from dust. For the Sumerians, those silences were not empty. They were sacred intervals, pauses in which meaning gathered itself. Between each dynasty, between each fall of a city, between each descent of kingship, there is space, the quiet breath of the divine. The King's List is written within that breath. Every number, every name, every repetition of "then the flood swept over" carries a strange patience, as if the scribes knew that what they were describing would happen again. And perhaps it has, not as literal floodwaters, but as waves of forgetting that have washed over every civilization since. Our modern histories are filled with beginnings and ends, but the Sumerians wrote in circles. Their understanding of time feels almost geological, layered, recursive, alive. The flood was both apocalypse and origin, both destruction and renewal. Kingship's descent was both restoration and rehearsal. To them, every ending carried within it a seed of its own return. The list is less a chronicle than a breathing cycle, an early articulation of what modern cosmology calls recurrence. The world, like memory, must die to remember itself. The names of the first kings, Alulim, Alalgar, Enman-Loana, drift through that ancient rhythm like constellations across the dark. They are symbols now, but perhaps they always were. Their long reigns were never meant to be plausible. They were meant to remind. 30,000 years is not a measure of duration. It is a measure of harmony. It is the arithmetic of divine order expressed through human awe. The Sumerians did not exaggerate. They translated eternity into number the way we translate feeling into language. If one traces those numbers closely, patterns emerge, multiples of 60, harmonics of the lunar cycle, ratios found later in temple design and musical scales. It is as if the King's List encodes in mathematical form the very architecture of their world, a cosmos built on rhythm, proportion, and repetition. When the flood comes, it does not destroy that architecture. It only resets it, clearing the ground so that the pattern can begin again. And perhaps this is what makes the list so haunting. It carries no fear of oblivion. The Sumerians accepted that all things end, yet they believed endings were only transitions. Even the flood was not punishment, but rebalancing, the world correcting its own dissonance. Kingship descends again, not because humanity deserves it, but because the pattern demands it. It is not mercy that returns order to the earth. It is rhythm. The divine to them was not willful but cyclical, a law of recurrence written into the bones of reality. In our age, that idea feels almost alien. We imagine the divine as intention, history as progress. We long for direction, not return. Yet the Sumerians remind us that perhaps meaning lies not in the journey forward, but in the return itself. Each rediscovery of their words, each translation of their tablets, is another descent. Knowledge coming down once more into a world that is forgotten. We think we're studying them, but in truth, we're continuing them. Their cycle never ended. It merely shifted mediums from clay to paper, from paper to code, from temple chants to digital archives. The descent now occurs through data. Yet the impulse is the same, to align the human with the infinite. When modern scholars reassembled the fragments of the King's List, they noticed something remarkable. Every version ends abruptly. There is no closure, no final reign. The text stops as if mid-breath. Some copies even break off mid-sentence, leaving the last word half-carved. For years, this was attributed to damage, to erosion, missing pieces, accidents of time. But perhaps it was intentional. Perhaps the list was never meant to end. Its incompleteness is its completion. History, like kingship, must always remain open, waiting for the next descent. The Sumerians seemed to understand that to write was to participate in eternity. The act of inscribing clay was itself divine, a descent of thought into matter, of breath into permanence. Each stroke of the stylus echoed the first act of creation, when a form emerged from chaos. To write was to reenact Genesis. That belief may be why their words still feel alive. They were not recording. They were summoning. And yet the most profound truth of the King's List may be its humility. For all its grandeur, it does not claim omniscience. It acknowledges its own incompleteness. Between each dynasty lies a gap, a silence that no scribe tries to fill. The list accepts what it cannot know, and in that acceptance lies its enduring wisdom. The Sumerians knew that mystery was not ignorance but reverence. What cannot be written must still be remembered. That humility stands in contrast to our own age, which fears gaps, rushes to fill every silence with explanation. We seek certainty where the ancients sought balance. They measured truth not by proof, but by harmony. A belief was not judged by accuracy, but by whether it resonated with the cosmic order. The King's List has survived because it embodies that resonance. It neither explains nor demands. It simply exists in quiet equilibrium with the unknown. Perhaps that is why its words still move us, not because we believe them, but because we recognize ourselves within their silence. We too are creatures between floods. We too build and lose, remember and forget. We too feel the faint pull of something higher that once descended and might one day return. The list whispers that this rhythm is not tragedy, but grace. That to begin again is not failure, but the universe breathing in. The clay that carries the King's List is unremarkable, coarse, brown, brittle, and yet it has outlived every empire that ever sought eternity. That too is part of the lesson. What endures is never the grand or the powerful, but the humble act of remembering. A scribe with a reed, a line pressed into clay. That is all it takes to resist the flood. When kingship descended from heaven, the Sumerians wrote, and perhaps even now it continues to descend, not as thunder or light, but as thought, as wonder, as the quiet awareness that time is not moving away from its source, but slowly returning to it. The list is the map of that return. Its destination is not the past, but remembrance itself. There is something almost unbearable about how the Sumerian Kings List ends, not with closure, but with a vanishing. The words simply stop, as if the writer's hand paused mid-gesture leaving the thought suspended between worlds. That silence feels deliberate, as though the Sumerians wanted their final statement to dissolve rather than conclude, to drift back into the same mystery from which it came. For a civilization obsessed with memory, there is something deeply poetic about ending in incompletion. Perhaps they understood that no record can contain the divine, that the moment you try to capture eternity, it escapes. The more we learn about Sumer, the clearer that paradox becomes. They built the first cities, yet their myths are filled with floods. They invented writing, yet their greatest text is unfinished. They measured the stars, yet described heaven not as a place, but as a rhythm. To them, order was not permanent. It was cyclical, always descending, always withdrawing. Kingship was not conquest. It was stewardship. It came from heaven not to dominate the earth, but to remind it of harmony. Every time kingship descended, the world was briefly aligned again, like a chord struck between heaven and clay. It is easy to imagine the scribes who copied the list, sitting by a lamplight in their mud brick rooms, pressing reeds into damp tablets, while the river's wind whispered through the shutters. Perhaps they knew their empires would fade, their gods would change names, their temples would crumble. But they wrote anyway, because to write was to resist oblivion. The act itself was faith, a declaration that meaning could outlast the flood. They did not expect to be remembered. They expected the pattern to continue. And so it has. The flood has come many times since, in many forms, fire, war, forgetting. And yet the clay survives. Each rediscovery of their words is another descent of kingship. Knowledge returning to the surface. When the tablets were first unearthed in the 19th century, their language was unreadable. The wedge marks were thought to be decoration. Only later, when cuneiform was deciphered, did the whisper grow audible again, and as it did, the ancient rhythm stirred once more. The King's List spoke, and humanity remembered that it had been here before. That moment, when modern scholars first understood those words, mirrors the descent itself. From silence came meaning. From clay came memory. It is as if the gods of old had not vanished, but merely changed form, waiting for us to remember how to read them. The Sumerians would have smiled at that thought. They always believed that divine wisdom sleeps until called. Knowledge does not die. It simply waits for new instruments to awaken it. In that sense, the Sumerian Kings List is more than archaeology. It is prophecy fulfilled through time. Its cycles of descent and flood are not only cosmic, but psychological echoes of how consciousness itself rises and falls. Every civilization, every mind, carries its own version of the flood. Moments when meaning collapses, when the world feels emptied of direction. And every renaissance, every rediscovery, is another descent of kingship, another spark of order returning from the silence. The Sumerians would not have called this optimism. They would have called it balance. For them, chaos was not evil. It was the raw clay from which form was shaped. Flood and kingship were not enemies. They were partners in creation. To live within that rhythm was to accept that destruction is sacred too. Perhaps that is the greatest wisdom they left us. The courage to let things end, trusting that what truly matters will descend again. As we study their fragments today, we find that their vision of time aligns curiously with what modern science has begun to uncover. Cosmologists speak of cyclic universes, of expansions and contractions, of entropy and renewal, a cosmic breathing not unlike the Sumerian understanding of descent and flood. The same intuition appears in physics, in myth, in biology. It is as though the oldest civilization and the newest science are looking at the same truth through different eyes. That the universe does not progress. It pulses. But where science describes, the Sumerians remembered their knowledge was experiential, embodied in ritual and architecture, in the slow rhythm of planting and harvest. They felt the descent not as theory, but as atmosphere in the rains that returned, the stars that realigned, the steady breathing of the Tigris Euphrates. Their world was alive with recurrence. To them, immortality was not in escaping time, but in participating in its cycles with grace. That grace lingers still. When we look at their temples, we see not grandeur, but patience. Stones stacked upon older stones, rebuilt endlessly after each flood. When we read their words, we hear not certainty, but reverence. The Sumerians never claimed to own truth. They only promised to remember it long enough for the next generation to find it again. That is why their clay has endured while marble has turned to dust. Humility, not might, is what survives. In that humility, one finds something startlingly modern. The Sumerians did not separate myth from science, nor faith from observation. They understood that knowledge stripped of reverence becomes sterile. That facts alone cannot hold the weight of wonder. Their King's List is an act of synthesis. Part mathematics, part liturgy, part dream. It is humanity's first attempt to reconcile logic with mystery, an attempt we are still making. Perhaps that is why the list continues to speak across millennia. It reminds us that history itself is sacred, that memory is a temple we must keep rebuilding. Each generation adds a new layer, not to perfect the structure, but to preserve the rhythm. The Sumerians knew that perfection was not the goal. Endurance was. They trusted the flood, knowing that even if all else washed away, the clay would remain, and so it has. Their words etched in earth outlived bronze and iron, empire and creed. They have outlasted the very rivers that shaped them. They endure because they never claimed permanence. They only promised return. When kingship descended from heaven, they wrote, and in that one line lies everything. The rise, the fall, the silence, and the song. Perhaps the list ends abruptly because it was never meant to end. Perhaps the scribe stopped because he knew the rest would be written by others, by us. The flood will come again as it always does. The clay will be buried again as it always has. But the rhythm will continue as it always must. And somewhere beneath the dust of forgotten cities, or the glow of our own screens, the same words will whisper once more. Kingship has descended again. It begins as it always has with silence. The same silence that lingered before the first descent, before the first mark of the stylus met the clay. It is a silence that waits, patient as the earth itself, for memory to return. The Sumerians knew this silence well. They lived within it, built upon it, and spoke through it. Every temple, every song, every inscription was an attempt to bridge that quiet distance between heaven and earth. The King's List was their bridge made permanent, the whisper of a world that refused to forget. And yet, as the final fragments show, even their bridge could not escape erosion. The text ends in fragments, its final kings fading into half, legal lines. The last words are little more than traces of meaning, a sentence swallowed by time, but that vanishing feels less like loss and more like fulfillment, as though the list itself understood that history, when it reaches too far, must surrender to silence again. For the Sumerians, all descent ends where it began, in the quiet from which the divine once came. Perhaps that is why the list does not end with lamentation. There is no cry for eternity, no plea for preservation. It simply stops as if pausing to breathe before the next cycle. To the modern eye, that incompleteness might seem tragic. But to the Sumerian mind, it was necessary. The flood would come again. The clay would crack again. The words would one day be rewritten in another tongue by another hand. The unfinished tablet was not a failure. It was an invitation, and we have accepted that invitation even if unknowingly. Each time we uncover a tablet, translate a fragment, or speak their words aloud, we become part of the same cycle. The descent continues no longer as divine kingship, but as understanding, awareness, remembrance. The clay has changed form. The heavens have become invisible. But the rhythm endures. The list is still being written, not on mud and reed, but in thought, in memory, in the persistence of curiosity. It is humbling to realize that the oldest record of human history is not about humans at all. It begins with gods, with celestial order, with forces that shaped existence before men could name them. The Sumerians did not see themselves as creators of civilization, but as caretakers of something handed down, something sacred and incomprehensible. Kingship did not rise from the soil. It descended like light, like music, like a memory too vast to belong to any one age. Their writing was not invention, but continuation, not proclamation, but listening. That attitude, the humility to receive rather than to claim, may be the truest mark of their greatness. Modern civilization prides itself on progress, on creation ex nihilo. But the Sumerians would have smiled at that notion. To them, nothing truly new ever existed. Everything was a descent, a reappearance, a pattern replayed in new form. To remember was to participate in creation. To forget was to dissolve into flood. This rhythm, descent, flood, renewal, shapes not only their myth, but their architecture, their mathematics, even their view of death. They did not imagine the afterlife as paradise or punishment, but as continuation. Life was a layer upon a deeper layer. The dead did not vanish. They joined the sediment of memory from which the next generation would build. Every burial mound, every ziggurat, every temple foundation was both tomb and seed. The King's List reflects that same cosmology, an ascent made from countless descents, each reign built upon the ruins of the last. When we look back across 5,000 years, it is tempting to think the Sumerians are gone, that their world of gods and floods and eternal recurrence has been replaced by data and light. Yet their breath is still in ours. We count their numbers. We speak their myths in new languages. We live by their measure of hours and days. We shape our cities as they did in grids aligned to the stars. We still search for meaning in cycles, still build towers to bridge earth and sky. The descent continues, only subtler now, hidden in the pulse of electricity and the hum of machines. And perhaps somewhere deep beneath our progress, the same fear still stirs, the fear of forgetting. The Sumerians built against that fear. They turned mud into memory, time into matter. We do the same, only with glass and code. We build archives, databases, networks, digital ziggurats rising toward invisible heavens. Yet the question remains unchanged. Will our records endure when the next flood comes? What clay will preserve us? Maybe that is what the Sumerians were warning us about all along. Not through prophecy, but through pattern. The flood is not water. It is erasure. It comes whenever humanity believes it has escaped the cycle. Whenever it forgets that dissent and humility are the roots of order, their King's List, simple and unyielding, stands as both memory and mirror. It reflects not only their time, but all time. The eternal struggle to remember what once descended, and to keep that memory alive in the face of the inevitable tide. Somewhere in a museum under sterile light, one of those tablets still bears the faint imprint of a scribe's fingertip, a ridge of skin pressed into clay 5 millennia ago, a mark so small it could be mistaken for imperfection. Yet it is perhaps the truest symbol of the entire list. The human touch upon divine order, the trace of the mortal hand preserving the rhythm of the immortal. That fingerprint is kingship too, not power but presence. The link between heaven and earth rendered tangible. As we reach the end of this journey, it is impossible to ignore the symmetry. The Sumerians once looked back at a world erased by water, and we look back at them through the flood of time. Both acts are the same: to remember through ruins, to rebuild through story. We are not their descendants by blood, but by memory. The clay they shaped is now the mirror we peer into, seeing our own reflection in its ancient pattern. When kingship descended from heaven, the phrase still carries weight not as myth, but as reminder. It tells us that civilization itself is not invention but remembrance. That every discovery is a rediscovery. That wisdom does not belong to the present but returns to it. The Sumerians wrote their story for the future, trusting that when the silence lifted again, someone would listen. And we have listened. We have found their words, pieced them together, read them aloud once more. The descent has happened again softly, invisibly through thought and translation. The flood will come again as it must, but so will the remembrance. That is the promise sealed within the clay. The King's List, incomplete and eternal, ends where it began, in the silence before the next breath, waiting for heaven to descend once